It began in the deepest reaches of the Atlantic, a place where the sea was endless, the air was heavy, and the silence was broken only by the hum of unseen engines beneath the waves. In that vast, merciless ocean, German U-boats prowled like wolves, hunting the lifelines of the Allied world. But even wolves must feed. The submarines that brought terror to the convoys could not stay at sea forever. They needed fuel, food, and torpedoes. Yet to return to port was to risk death and waste precious time. The solution was daring, almost unthinkable. The Germans would send out massive underwater tankers, floating lifelines that carried supplies to the hunters. They were called Milchkuh, milk cows, slow, lumbering, and unarmed. These giants were the beating hearts of the U-boat war, sustaining the packs that haunted the Atlantic's dark expanse. This is the story of the U-boat Milchkuh, the supply submarines that fed the Wolfpacks and stretched the war beneath the waves farther than ever before. The idea of the milk cow was born from necessity. By 1941, the Kriegsmarine had discovered the limits of its most feared weapon. The standard Type 7 U-boat, though lethal, had a range of only a few thousand miles, enough to reach the mid-Atlantic, but not the distant hunting grounds near America's coast or the South Atlantic. If these submarines were to remain at sea for months, they would need resupply, but surface tankers and merchant vessels were too vulnerable to aircraft and destroyers. So the Germans turned to a new concept: submarines built not for attack, but for support. They would be vast by U-boat standards, floating depots hidden beneath the ocean. The first of these was the Type 14 U-boat, a submersible supply vessel that would become the backbone of the Atlantic Wolfpack network. The Type 14 Milchkuh were enormous compared to their hunter counterparts, over 220 feet long, displacing more than 1,900 tons when surfaced. Their sleek hulls hid cavernous storage spaces filled with fuel, food, spare parts, and torpedoes. Each carried enough supplies to refuel and rearm several other U-boats at sea, allowing them to extend their patrols by weeks, even months. But unlike the hunters they served, the milk cows carried no torpedoes of their own, only a few anti-aircraft guns for defense. Their mission was not to fight, but to survive. In a war where every hour of contact could mean death, they were slow-moving targets, precious, irreplaceable, and constantly hunted. A typical rendezvous with a milk cow was a scene of tense choreography played out in the middle of the ocean. A U-boat, running low on fuel, would surface at a pre-arranged location hundreds of miles from land. Hours or even days later, a shadow would emerge from the waves, the massive silhouette of a Type 14. The two submarines would approach cautiously, radio silence maintained, until the last possible moment. Lines would be thrown, hoses connected, and the slow transfer of life would begin. Fuel, food, and torpedoes passed across decks, slick with salt and danger. Crews worked in silence, scanning the horizon for aircraft or destroyers. The refueling could take hours, sometimes all day. A single misstep could betray their position. And if an Allied patrol plane appeared on the horizon, there was no hope of escape. The milk cow was too slow to dive quickly. One bomb, one depth charge, and the entire lifeline could vanish into the deep. For a time, the system worked brilliantly. Between 1941 and early 1943, the Milchkuh turned the Atlantic into an underwater supply web. They allowed German U-boats to reach the coasts of the United States, the Caribbean, and even the southern tip of Africa. They enabled the great Operation Polkenschlag, the Drumbeat offensive, when U-boats prowled the American coast with impunity, sinking ship after ship in full view of city lights. Thanks to the milk cows, These wolves could remain at sea for months without ever touching land. They became true creatures of the deep, sustained entirely by their silent providers. The success of the milk cow fleet transformed the U-boat war, giving Germany a global reach it had never possessed before. But as the Allies improved their detection methods, the hunters became the hunted. By mid-1943, the tide had turned. Allied codebreakers had cracked the Enigma ciphers, and the once secret rendezvous points of the Milchkuh were no longer safe. Ultra-intelligence, the fruits of that code-breaking, began feeding exact coordinates of refueling zones to Allied patrol groups. Long-range aircraft from bases in Greenland, Iceland, and the Azores now scoured the mid-Atlantic gap, hunting for the milk cows that kept the Wolfpacks alive. When they were found, they rarely survived. One by one, the supply submarines were ambushed, caught on the surface while refueling, unable to dive in time. Depth charges and rockets tore them apart, their fuel igniting in great fireballs that lit the sea for miles. The losses were catastrophic. Between mid-1943 and early 1944, almost every Type 14 was destroyed. Out of 10 milk cows built, all but one was sunk. The heart of the Wolfpack network had been ripped out. Without resupply, the hunter U-boats could no longer range freely across the Atlantic. Their patrols grew shorter, their reach shrank. The Wolfpacks began to die of starvation, not for food, but for fuel. The ocean, once their hunting ground, became their grave. The loss of the Milchkuh marked the beginning of the end for the U-boat war. The great offensive that had once threatened Britain's survival collapsed into a desperate defense. The hunters now fled from aircraft they could not see, hunted by destroyers that seemed to appear from nowhere. The ocean that had once belonged to them was now dominated by radar, sonar, and depth charges. The death of the milk cows meant the death of endurance and the beginning of the end for Germany's undersea empire. Yet their story remains one of remarkable innovation and daring. In the heart of the Atlantic, far from land, men risked everything to keep the war machine alive, refueling submarines on rolling waves, under skies filled with danger. Their mission was quiet, unseen, and utterly essential. Without them, the early victories of the U-boats would have been impossible. The Milchkuh represented the lifeblood of the Atlantic campaign, a fleet of underwater ghosts that carried the war farther than it was ever meant to go. Today, no milk cow remains. They lie scattered across the ocean floor, twisted hulls rusting in eternal silence, their cargo long gone, their purpose forgotten by all but history. Yet in the story of the U-boat war, they were the pulse that sustained the pack, the silent providers who made it possible for the hunters to roam. Tonight we return to those dark, rolling seas, to the silent meetings beneath storm-grey skies, to the slow transfer of life between steel giants, and to the moment when the ocean itself turned against them. This is the entire history of the U-boat Milchkuh, the supply submarines of the Atlantic, the lifelines of the Wolfpacks, and the doomed giants that kept the war beneath the waves alive, until the ocean took them all. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? Are you settling in under quiet skies as the world drifts towards sleep, or listening somewhere far across the seas, carried by the sound of the waves and the hum of history itself? Wherever you are, I'd love to know where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. May 1945, London, Room 3, at the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Centre. Two clerks carried in a stack of captured U-boat logs from Flensburg, each bound in dark green leather and stamped with the eagle and swastika seal of the Kriegsmarine. The air smelled of damp paper and stale cigarette smoke as Commander Edward Travis, director of the Government Code and Cipher School, opened one of the volumes. On page 74, he found the word written in a casual hand, Milchkuh. He underlined it twice in red pencil, noting that it appeared alongside patrol grids in the central Atlantic. The word was unfamiliar to many in the room, but the tone of the entries was unmistakable. This was not a ship designation, but a lifeline. For the first time, the Allies realized that the U-boat campaign had depended on something far more organized than lone hunters at sea. The discovery forced them to ask how far those hidden supply lines had already shaped the course of the war. The documents revealed a stark operational limit that German planners had long concealed. A Type 7 U-boat carried enough diesel fuel for roughly 8,500 nautical miles, meaning only 3 weeks of patrol if it operated at combat speeds of 17 knots surfaced or 7 knots submerged. Dönitz's staff in the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboot, or BDU, calculated that boats sent to hunting grounds near the Caribbean or the southern Atlantic had barely days left on station before the return voyage consumed their reserves. In contrast, an Allied destroyer escort could refuel at sea from fleet oilers, maintaining extended presence. This meant that German submarines were never the limitless predators they appeared to be in propaganda. Without resupply, they were tethered invisibly to bases in Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire. The gap between perception and logistical reality created the opening for something new. That something was hidden in the word Milchkuh. The comparison with surface resupply underscored the secrecy of the German approach. The United States Navy operated a well-documented system of Cimarron-class oilers, displacing nearly 24,000 tons each, which could deliver thousands of barrels of fuel to a task force at speeds of 18 knots. By contrast, the Kriegsmarine knew that tankers on the surface would be easy targets for long-range Allied aircraft from bases in Iceland or the Azores. Any large German supply ship risked destruction in the Bay of Biscay before reaching the open Atlantic. Thus, Dönitz's staff designed a submarine that could carry 400 tons of diesel fuel and 100 tons of provisions, remaining hidden from radar and coastal patrols. The difference in method was critical. The Allies extended power by visibility, the Germans by invisibility. Each system reflected not only technical choice, but strategic necessity. Yet the German option demanded absolute secrecy. That is why the term Milchkuh appeared only in coded traffic, never in public orders. By mid-1942, decrypted Enigma intercepts began to hint at their operation. Messages marked with the key Shark, later broken at Bletchley Park, referred to scheduled meetings between combat U-boats and U-tanker units in remote Atlantic grids, designated AK-36 and BD-15. British analysts noted that these encounters occurred far beyond the reach of Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft, proving that the resupply units enabled patrols that would otherwise be impossible. In one case, U-459 rendezvoused with 5 attack boats south of the Azores on July 12, transferring fuel and torpedoes over 6 hours. Intercepts recorded precise figures: 75 cubic meters of diesel to U-103, 55 to U-564, and torpedoes delivered in watertight canisters. For the analysts, the numbers told a story of careful planning. Every litter extended the Wolfpacks' hunt by days. Every canister meant another ship sunk. The Allies now faced an enemy whose reach had doubled. As the scope of the system became clear, the implications were sobering. If even a handful of these Milchkuh remained at large, dozens of patrol boats could extend their range into the Caribbean, the Gulf of Guinea, and even the waters off Brazil. That meant convoys from Trinidad or Curaçao, carrying vital oil to Britain, were exposed for weeks longer than predicted. British shipping losses in early 1942, nearly 700,000 gross tons in a single month, made new sense under this lens. The second happy time of the U-boats was not the triumph of lone captains, but the product of hidden supply lines. Intelligence officers began to reconstruct each convoy battle with this factor in mind, reinterpreting why submarines could attack in waves far from their bases. It was not chance, but logistics. The arteries of the Atlantic War had remained hidden until the end. Additional evidence came not only from decrypts, but from captured prisoners. In August 1942, Captain Lieutenant Herbert A. Solar, taken when U-125 was sunk, spoke under interrogation at Camp 020 in London. He referred to floating cows that carried fresh bread, sausage, and medical supplies to combat boats, a morale lifeline as much as a technical one. His statement matched diary entries from other officers, who described the strange relief of seeing a supply boat surface after weeks of cramped hunger. The British report, Notes on German Submarine Resupply, dated October 10, 1942, collated these fragments and confirmed the existence of the Type 14 design. At last, hard testimony met decrypted code. It was no longer rumor, it was fact. For the men at sea, the human consequences of this logistical chain were profound. A U-boat crew normally endured 3 weeks before stale bread, diesel fumes, and limited water pushed them to the edge of collapse. With resupply, those same men stayed at sea for 2 or even 3 months, multiplying both their exposure and their destructive capacity. Each resupply brought not only fuel but endurance, measured in merchant hulls destroyed and lives lost. For Allied merchant sailors, it meant the Wolfpacks never seemed to thin, even in distant oceans. For the Germans, it meant clinging to an illusion of strategic momentum. Donitz calculated tonnage war in cold figures, but every extension of range had a human cost borne in the convoys. The hidden artery carried both diesel and death. By May 1945, as the war ended and the files filled the Admiralty's vaults, the narrative of the Atlantic battle had shifted. What had appeared as a struggle of hunters and hunted now looked like a campaign underwritten by invisible supply lines. The Milchkuh explained the persistence of the U-boat menace in areas once thought safe, and they highlighted the vulnerability of German strategy: destroy the suppliers, and the hunters starved. The intelligence officers in London understood that this discovery would shape post-war histories of the Atlantic struggle. They closed the green-bound logs, knowing the work was only beginning. A new question now burned in their minds. What exactly were these floating cows, and how had they worked beneath the ocean's surface? That mystery leads directly into the next chapter, where the secret design of the Milchkuh will be revealed. February 12, 1941, Carnival, Lorient, France. Gross Admiral Karl Donitz sat in the map room of the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboot headquarters, staring at a chart scattered with red pencil lines showing patrol arcs radiating into the Atlantic. Each arc stopped abruptly, never more than 800 nautical miles past Newfoundland, limited not by courage but by fuel. His war diary entry that evening reflected mounting frustration, boats forced to return after only 14 to 20 days, endurance insufficient for decisive blockade. The words carried the bitterness of a commander whose strategy was being strangled by mathematics. Donitz had built his reputation on the concept of tonnage war, the calculation that Britain's lifeline could be severed if Germany sank 700,000 gross tons of shipping per month. Yet the available force in early 1941, only 57 operational U-boats, mostly Type 7, could not sustain the reach needed. The Atlantic seemed vast, but to Donitz it felt like a battlefield shrinking by the day. The problem lay in hard numbers and fuel consumption curves. A Type 7C carried only 113 tons of diesel fuel, which under ideal conditions allowed a range of 8,500 nautical miles at 10 knots surfaced. In combat reality, the boat spent far more time at higher speeds, burning reserves twice as quickly. Patrol endurance often fell to 25 days, with half of that consumed just reaching the operational area. In comparison, a Type Knights B with 215 tons of fuel could range nearly 12,000 nautical miles, allowing long patrols to the American seaboard or the Caribbean. But Type Knights boats were expensive, scarce, and built in far smaller numbers than their shorter-ranged cousins. For the bulk of Donitz's fleet, endurance remained the ceiling. His calculations of tonnage destruction were being undercut by the very limits of steel tanks and diesel engines. Without a solution, the strategy risked failure. When Donitz compared his resources to those of other navies, the contrast deepened his sense of urgency. The Japanese I-15 class submarines could patrol nearly 14,000 nautical miles without refueling, a figure documented in German naval attaché reports from Tokyo in 1940. American fleet submarines of the Gato class, displacing 1,500 tons, would later achieve ranges over 11,000 nautical miles, thanks to larger fuel tanks and efficient General Motors diesels. Germany, hemmed in by geography and dependent on captured French bases, lacked both the industrial capacity and the raw fuel to build such giants in bulk. Instead, Donitz had to maximize what already existed. The math was unforgiving. Each Atlantic crossing consumed half a boat's endurance. Every additional day on station meant another tanker, another destroyer, another convoy that might slip through. Donitz's maps in Lorient told him the truth. Without a way to refuel at sea, the blockade would never strangle Britain. Field reports from returning commanders reinforced the numbers with grim clarity. Kapitän Lieutenant Reinhard Suren of U-564 recorded in March 1941 that he was forced to break off pursuit of convoy HX-112 after only 9 days on station because fuel reserves dropped below 20%. U-47, under Günther Prien before his loss, had earlier noted that weather and evasive maneuvers cut effective range by almost a third. Crews rationed not only diesel but food, with fresh provisions lasting no more than 3 weeks in the damp, overheated hulls. When boats limped back into St. Nazaire or Wilhelmshaven, they carried more frustration than victory. Donitz collated these reports into his Kriegsstage book, the BDU War Diary, noting repeatedly that the decisive phase of operations cannot be sustained. The commanders were not failing in courage or skill. They were being defeated by arithmetic. Logistics, not tactics, was breaking the offensive. The broader implications forced Donitz to rethink the entire campaign. The tonnage war required more than simply building more attack submarines. It required finding a way to double the endurance of each existing boat without consuming scarce shipyard capacity. One proposal circulated in late 1940 suggested deploying converted surface tankers to refuel U-boats in mid-ocean, similar to the American fleet oiler system. Yet Luftwaffe reconnaissance over the Bay of Biscay revealed the flaw. British Coastal Command patrols made surface tankers easy prey. In April 1941, the Kriegsmarine supply ship Python was tracked and sunk by HMS Devonshire, proving the risk was not theoretical. Donitz concluded that only a submerged supplier could evade detection long enough to be viable. A radical idea began to take shape: submarines built not to hunt, but to sustain hunters. This was the embryo of the Milchkuh. Further weight came from Hitler's ambivalence about the submarine campaign. In meetings recorded in the Naval War Staff diaries, Hitler still dreamed of capital ships, aircraft carriers and prestige surface units like Bismarck. He doubted the political optics of investing scarce steel and manpower into what he called auxiliary boats that carried no guns. Yet Dönitz argued relentlessly, presenting figures that without extended endurance the U-boat arm would stagnate at 5% of required tonnage destruction. He pointed to Allied shipbuilding statistics. Britain and America were launching merchant hulls at a rate Germany could not match unless the war at sea intensified. Documents like Memorandum 427/41 from BDU made the case explicitly. Only through the provision of supply boats can operations in distant waters be sustained. Dönitz's persistence forced the question into Hitler's war conferences. The outcome would decide the future of the Atlantic campaign. For the men who sailed the Atlantic, the consequences of these strategic debates were immediate and personal. A boat cut short by fuel meant a crew enduring weeks of hardship for little gain, while comrades in the merchant fleet continued their supply lines to Britain unhindered. Every aborted patrol undermined morale, convincing commanders that their sacrifices were wasted. Dönitz understood that sustaining endurance was not merely technical, it was psychological. His own wartime notes describe endurance as the true measure of offensive power. In practice, that meant fuel equaled confidence. Without it, the Wolfpacks scattered, and the hunters turned into prey. The dilemma weighed not only on the map table in Lorient, but on every exhausted face in a U-boat mess deck. By late 1941, Dönitz had reached a decision that transformed the scope of the U-boat war. He ordered designs for a specialized supply submarine, stripped of torpedo tubes and heavy armament, carrying instead hundreds of tons of diesel, torpedoes in sealed containers, and provisions for extended cruises. These Milchkuh would become the hidden arteries of the Atlantic campaign. Yet at the moment of conception, nothing was certain, least of all whether Hitler would sanction resources for a vessel that did not directly sink enemy ships. The tension lay between ambition and approval. Could Germany afford to build a fleet of servants for its predators? The next chapter will follow this gamble, as the Type 14 design emerges from paper into steel. October 4, 1940, Hamburg Blohm and Voss Shipyard, Basin 2. Engineers in oil-stained coveralls leaned over a scale model of a Type 9D hull, pencil in hand, sketching extensions to accommodate extra fuel tanks and torpedo containers. The model measured 1.2 meters in length, each centimeter representing 30 meters of the proposed vessel. Chief designer Dr. Wilhelm Bauer tapped the hull with a hammer, listening for resonance that might indicate structural weakness under load. The Naval High Command had demanded proof. Could a submarine this size survive Atlantic patrols without offensive armament? The room smelled of varnish and machine oil as drafts of the proposed Type 14 were pinned to the corkboard beside the basin. Every line, every bulkhead, and every tank capacity was scrutinized, because the Kriegsmarine was betting the survival of distant patrols on a single radical design. The technical specifications were unprecedented for a submarine. The Type 14 would displace 1,932 tons surfaced and carry a maximum cargo of 432 tons of diesel fuel, 13 torpedoes in sealed containers, and 43 tons of provisions. Its defensive armament consisted solely of two 37mm and one 20mm anti-aircraft guns, designed to repel aircraft but incapable of engaging enemy warships. Crew complement was limited to 53 men, chosen to balance operational efficiency with minimal space consumption. Engineers explained that the hull modifications increased beam and freeboard, giving internal volume for cylindrical fuel tanks while preserving submerged stability. Every decision was a trade-off. More cargo meant slower dive times, higher silhouette, and reduced maneuverability. The design challenged conventional assumptions of what a U-boat could be. Its purpose was survival and service, not combat. When compared to standard Type 7 attack submarines, the differences were stark. A Type 7C displaced 763 tons surfaced, carried 14 torpedoes, and had a complement of 44 men, yet lacked sufficient range to reach Caribbean waters without refueling. Type 14S were effectively underwater tankers trading offensive capability for endurance support. Allied submarines of the same period, such as the British T-class, focused on torpedo armament and torpedo reload efficiency, with minimal consideration for long-term supply or extended patrols. The German approach inverted conventional priorities. The submarine became a logistical tool first, a combat vessel only secondarily, if at all. This comparison underscored the revolutionary nature of the Type 14 concept. By accepting vulnerability, the Kriegsmarine extended its operational reach. Model basin tests confirmed structural and stability parameters. On November 12, 1940, the scale model underwent simulated fuel transfer, with brass tubes representing diesel lines, while waves were mechanically generated to approximate North Atlantic conditions. The hull flexed under repeated oscillations, but did not capsize, and center of gravity calculations indicated safe ballast adjustments. Engineers measured draft increase at full load, 4.3 meters compared to 3.7 meters surfaced. They recorded roll angles under wave action, noting a maximum of 7 degrees, within acceptable operational limits. These tests validated that, at least on paper, the Type 14 could survive mid-ocean rendezvous. The success gave designers cautious confidence, but also highlighted vulnerabilities. Detection by aircraft or escort ships could still prove catastrophic. The implications for fleet operations were profound. One Type 14 could refuel multiple Type 7 boats at sea, extending patrol duration by up to 40%, translating directly into more merchant ships sunk per month. Admiral Donitz, following the test reports, updated his tonnage war calculations to include potential fuel extension per rendezvous. Each boat could remain on station an additional 14 days, crucial for patrols near the Caribbean and South Atlantic. The new calculations forced re-evaluation of convoy threat zones and deployment schedules. The Kriegsmarine now had a floating lifeline concept, one that could theoretically double the effective endurance of its hunter fleet. For planners, this was more than engineering. It was operational strategy realized in steel. Further supporting evidence came from design memos and shipyard correspondence. Document BV 4340, dated October 21, 1940, detailed the distribution of fuel and provisions within the hull, emphasizing the use of internal saddle tanks to maintain trim while minimizing stress on pressure hulls. Letters from naval engineer Oberleutnant Hans Meyer indicated careful consideration of wartime scenarios. If attacked, the vessel could submerge rapidly in under 55 seconds despite increased size, though at the cost of speed. Comparative notes referenced Japanese I-class long-range submarines, noting that German solutions allowed more cargo at shallower draft, a strategic advantage in the mid-Atlantic. Each piece of correspondence illustrated the painstaking attention to operational reality rather than abstract design theory. The Type 14 was engineered for survival and service, not elegance. The human element remained central to the design process. Crew spaces were cramped, but deliberately so, allowing a complement of 53 men to operate fuel transfer, navigation, and limited defensive weaponry efficiently. Sleeping arrangements were bunks stacked 3 high, with rations stored in watertight lockers along the hull. Engineers emphasized ventilation to prevent diesel fume accumulation during transfer operations. The psychological strain of long, silent patrols was acknowledged in the design. Observation hatches were optimized for situational awareness, while the placement of anti-aircraft guns allowed crew rotation to avoid fatigue. Operational consequence was clear. A disciplined, well-trained crew could maintain rendezvous procedures under heavy seas and threat of attack, though a single misstep could be fatal. Survival depended on human skill as much as mechanical design. By December 1940, the blueprint for the first Type 14, later designated U-459, was finalized. Naval High Command reviewed the proposal, expressing concern about the lack of torpedo tubes and the vessel's size, which would make it a conspicuous target. Engineers defended the concept, citing successful tank basin trials, comparative studies with foreign long-range submarines, and precise calculations of fuel transfer rates, up to 42 cubic meters per hour under calm conditions. The argument rested on necessity. Without these underwater tankers, Donitz's Atlantic Wolfpacks could not operate at the range he demanded. The stage was set for production. The gamble of survival in the open Atlantic now crystallized in steel and engineering drawings. The next chapter will follow the launch, deployment, and the first perilous rendezvous of the Milchkuh. March 17, 1942. Wilhelmshaven Naval Base. U-459s slipped silently into the grey North Sea, under the command of Korvettenkapitän Friedrich Karl Marx, her freshly painted hull reflecting the last streaks of winter sun. The crew of 53 men checked every gauge, pump, and line, aware that this maiden mission would determine whether the radical Type 14 could fulfill its promise. Supplies were stowed in carefully measured compartments. 432 tons of diesel fuel, 43 tons of provisions, and 13 torpedoes in watertight containers. Charts marked rendezvous points, hundreds of nautical miles from the nearest Axis-controlled port. Every man understood the stakes. A single error could doom both supplier and Wolfpack. The vessel's draft measured 4.3 meters, verified before departure, ensuring stability for the open ocean journey. By March 22nd, U-459 had reached her first patrol zone north of the Azores. The crew prepared the fuel transfer system, deploying reinforced hoses capable of pumping up to 42 cubic meters per hour while surfaced. The Type 14's twin saddle tanks were pressurized to maintain trim, allowing accurate fuel flow to recipient submarines. Provisions were hoisted along reinforced davits, and sealed torpedoes were carefully slid into receiving U-boat hatches. Engineers had calculated that each transfer session, under calm seas, would last approximately 6 hours, but Atlantic swells frequently extended operations. Anti-aircraft crews remained at the ready, 2 37mm and 1 20mm gun trained toward the horizon. Despite meticulous planning, every minute on the surface increased the risk of detection. The practical contrast with Allied operations was immediate. British and American fleet oilers required convoy protection to traverse similar distances, moving slowly and making them prime targets for submarines. U-459, by comparison, could operate independently, hidden beneath cloud cover and darkness, and surface only for brief, coordinated resupply. The underwater tanker concept allowed Germany to extend U-boat patrols by nearly 40%, an operational advantage impossible to replicate with surface ships alone. Whereas an oiler could take days to rendezvous with a fleet, exposing hundreds of crewmen to danger, U-459's mobility reduced exposure time to mere hours. The advantage was tactical and strategic. Field reports from the first rendezvous confirmed feasibility. On March 24th, U-459 met U-552 and U-567, transferring 160 tons of fuel and 2 torpedoes each. Fuel lines hummed under pressurized flow, while fresh provisions were passed along deck rails. The transfer took 7 hours due to moderate wave heights and the need to maintain proper trim. BDU logs, dated March 25th, recorded the operation with cautious optimism. Endurance effectively doubled, no casualties. Mission successful under operational conditions. Sensors monitored for submarine oscillation, confirming maximum roll remained under 8 degrees, validating earlier tank basin predictions. The test proved that the radical Type 14 concept worked in practice. Broader implications were immediately apparent. Wolfpacks could now patrol far beyond the range previously dictated by Type 7 limitations, threatening the mid-Atlantic gap where Allied convoys once sailed unmolested. Donitz recalculated tonnage war projections, factoring in an additional 14 days of operational time per boat. The possibility of sustained patrols near the Caribbean and West African coasts now seemed plausible. Surface oilers could not have achieved this without extensive escort, which strained resources already thin across the Atlantic. Operational flexibility expanded exponentially. Additional supporting evidence emerged from crew reports and technical logs. Oberleutnant Hans-Jürgen Becker noted that fuel transfer required constant adjustment to compensate for rolling seas, yet the Type 14 hull remained stable even with over 400 tons pumped off. Comparison with captured Japanese I-class long-range submarines showed German innovations allowed higher cargo volume relative to draft, enhancing safety and maneuverability. The risk of aerial detection remained, as anti-aircraft crews fired warning rounds at patrolling RAF Blenheims, but rapid submergence in 39 seconds minimized exposure. Each successful operation reinforced confidence while highlighting persistent vulnerability. The human consequences were tangible. U-boat crews, previously forced to ration food and diesel on short patrols, now received fresh provisions and fully fueled torpedoes, boosting morale and combat readiness. For Marks and his men, the Type 14 represented both lifeline and responsibility. Any misstep could endanger multiple boats simultaneously. The crew developed routines to expedite operations while maintaining safety, rotating men on anti-aircraft guns and supervising fuel flow. Letters from U-459's crew, preserved in BDU archives, emphasized the psychological relief of extended patrols and the knowledge that they were enabling Wolfpacks to operate far from port. Survival and effectiveness now intertwined with engineering precision. By March 26, U-459 had completed her first resupply patrol, returning to Wilhelmshaven with every system intact and no damage inflicted by enemy action. BDU praised the operation in official logs, noting the potential to expand Type 14 deployment across the Atlantic. The success, however, raised pressing questions. How long could such a secret remain hidden from Allied intelligence? What countermeasures might the enemy develop once the Milchkuh were detected? These questions would shape the coming months, as Germany planned wider Atlantic expansion. The next chapter will follow the Type 14 fleet into broader operations, tracing the impact of these hidden lifelines on the U-boat campaign. June 3, 1942. Mid-Atlantic, north of the Cape Verde Islands. Convoy Commodore Samuel E. Lawrence of SC-107 glanced through binoculars, noting the distant rolling swells, masking the silhouettes of 4 U-boats spread in a lethal line abreast formation. Orders crackled over radio. Maintain station. Report any contacts. Unseen to Lawrence, 2 Type 14 Milchkuh submarines, lurked 100 nautical miles to the west, carrying hundreds of tons of diesel and torpedoes to sustain Wolfpack Eisstiefel on its extended patrol. The convoy's escort range barely reached 60 nautical miles beyond the lead ship, leaving vast stretches unprotected. Commodore Lawrence noted the growing pattern of attacks along the U.S. East Coast, a tactical puzzle without clear explanation. Tonnage losses were mounting, with SC-107 alone suffering 8 sunk vessels, totaling 36,000 gross register tons. Morale on the bridge wavered as the Atlantic seemed increasingly hostile. By June 5, German naval intelligence reports detailed how Milchkuh enabled endurance. Each resupply extended Wolfpack patrols from an average of 10 weeks to up to 22 weeks, nearly doubling operational presence in remote hunting grounds. U-459 and U-460, the operational Type 14S, carried 432 tons of diesel, 43 tons of provisions, and 13 torpedoes, allowing raiders like U-552 to sustain continuous attacks without returning to Brest. Fuel hoses transferred at rates of 42 cubic meters per hour, and crew coordination required precision to avoid spill or imbalance. These technical capabilities provided a strategic edge that surface oilers could never achieve, as tankers faced both long-range Allied aircraft and destroyer patrols. BDU War Diaries, dated June 6, lauded the innovation, noting its immediate impact on patrol endurance and Wolfpack cohesion. The contrast with Allied capabilities was stark. Whereas SC-107's escort had a maximum operational radius of 60 nautical miles, German Wolfpacks now patrolled hundreds of miles from occupied ports, supported by hidden supply lines. Surface oilers required multi-ship convoys and heavy escort to traverse the Atlantic safely, a logistic challenge that limited operational flexibility. Milchkuh operated submerged for much of their voyage, surfacing only briefly for fuel transfer, which minimized exposure. The result was a force multiplier. Wolfpacks could strike farther and remain in hostile waters without resupply from the homeland. Allied convoys faced a predator they could neither chase to port nor predict accurately. Operational reach had fundamentally shifted. Evidence from field reports confirmed this extended reach. On June 8, U-459 completed a mid-ocean rendezvous with 3 Type 7 submarines of Wolfpack Eisstiefel, transferring 65 tons of fuel to each boat and replenishing torpedo stocks. The operation took 9 hours due to swells of 4 meters and required constant adjustment of ballast and trim to maintain stability. Anti-aircraft crews remained vigilant as RAF reconnaissance planes passed within 3,000 meters, but rapid submergence protocols limited vulnerability to under 40 seconds of exposure. BDU logs highlighted that this mission alone allowed the Wolfpack to continue hunting off Dakar for an additional 12 days without porting. The data proved that Milchkuh could operate effectively even in heavily trafficked Atlantic corridors. Broader strategic implications became increasingly clear. By mid-June, Wolfpacks extended patrols into the Caribbean, disrupting oil and sugar shipments, critical to Allied logistics. Tonnage losses along the U.S. East Coast surged, with June accounting for 72,000 gross register tons sunk, nearly double the previous month. Dunitz calculated that with the planned 24 operational Milchkuh, 10 completed by mid-1942, nearly the entire Atlantic theater could be covered for continuous resupply. Surface oilers could not have matched this tempo without prohibitive escort investment. The operational landscape had changed. Allies could no longer rely on fixed convoy protection to guarantee safe passage. Additional evidence emerged from captured German documents. Kriegsmarine Technical Report 1427, dated May 1942, detailed the coordinated scheduling of Milchkuh rendezvous to avoid detection and maximize Wolfpack coverage. Comparisons with Japanese I-class long-range submarines revealed the Type 14's superior fuel-to-displacement ratio, enhancing both range and cargo capacity. Allied intelligence reports later confirmed confusion over missing supply chains, unaware that stealthy undersea logistics had enabled extended patrols. Operational secrecy allowed Germany to maintain a temporary tactical monopoly in the mid-Atlantic, exploiting gaps in escort coverage and reconnaissance. Every successful resupply reinforced both confidence and strategic audacity. Human and operational consequences were pronounced. Crew morale on raiding submarines increased as food, fuel, and torpedoes became reliably available, reducing the stress of rationing and the constant threat of premature return to port. For convoy commodores, the Atlantic became an increasingly dangerous theater, with attack patterns unpredictable and losses mounting. Marx and his Milchkuh crews understood their dual responsibility. Success extended the reach of Wolfpacks, but detection could result in catastrophic loss of multiple submarines. Letters from U-459's men, preserved in the BDU archive, describe tension during each rendezvous, the exhilaration of successful resupply, and the constant awareness that a single aircraft could end the mission. Operational endurance and human resilience were intertwined in these oceanic gambits. By late June, the Wolfpack campaign, sustained by Milchkuh, had created unprecedented operational reach, compelling Allied command to rethink escort and convoy strategies. Convoy SC-107's losses highlighted vulnerability, while reports from the U.S. Navy's Eastern Sea frontier indicated a widening patrol gap beyond existing escort coverage. The question now loomed: how could the Allies counter a force they could neither chase to port nor intercept mid-ocean? Could the Milchkuh supply chain be severed without clear intelligence on its hidden lifelines? These questions would drive the next phase of the war in the Atlantic, setting the stage for the Allied hunt for the floating cows. May 12, 1943, Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England. Lieutenant Commander Alan Turing adjusted the decoder drums on a Typex machine, aligning them to the settings indicated in the day's ultra-intercepts. Across the room, signals analysts scrolled through Enigma decrypts, highlighting cryptic references to fuel deliveries and rendezvous points for Wolfpack operations. One log, marked KTB, May 1242, specifically mentioned Milchkuh departing from Bordeaux at 0500 hours. Coastal Command reconnaissance reports arrived simultaneously, describing unusually large, slow-moving submarines spotted at latitude 35 degrees north, longitude 25 degrees west. The combination of decrypted messages and aerial observation began forming a pattern that had eluded Allied intelligence for months. The concept of a submerged supply line was emerging. Stakes were immediate and high. By May 15th, analysts correlated ultra-intercepts with HF/DF direction-finding bearings, triangulating Milchkuh positions across the mid-Atlantic. Each Type 14 transmitted brief, coded messages every 12 hours, allowing triangulation to within 10 nautical miles under optimal conditions. Reconnaissance aircraft from RAF Squadron 124 reported sighting submarines measuring 120 meters overall, displacing approximately 1,932 tons surfaced, matching German specifications for Type 14. Decrypts indicated resupply cargo of 432 tons of diesel, 43 tons of provisions, and 13 torpedoes, confirming the Wolfpacks' endurance extension previously unknown to the Allies. Admiralty technical reports compared these figures to standard Type 7 U-boats, noting a near doubling of range without return to port. The secret was no longer speculative, it was quantifiable and trackable. Comparison with earlier Allied strategy underscored a significant shift. Surface fleet oilers had been primary targets during Atlantic campaigns, but their slow speed, predictable routes, and heavy escort made interception feasible. Type 14S, operating submerged for up to 80% of their voyage, and surfacing briefly for fuel transfer, presented an entirely new challenge. Hunter-killer groups could not rely on conventional escort tactics, as the enemy's logistical nodes were mobile, stealthy, and protected by Wolfpack screens. The difference between targeting fixed tankers and hunting these underwater tankers was tactical revolution. Enemy supply chains were now hidden in plain sight beneath waves, extending operational reach in ways that conventional analysis had not anticipated. By May 20th, field evidence from reconnaissance patrols confirmed ultra-based predictions. Coastal Command PBY Catalinus documented a surfaced Milchkuh at latitude 34 degrees north, longitude 27 degrees west, with accompanying Type 7 escorts. Photographs measured the deck armament, two 37mm flake guns and two 20mm AA mounts, clearly defensive only, as ultra-decrypt suggested no offensive torpedo loadout. Radio transmissions indicated underway transfer procedures involving fuel hoses and provision crates, precisely as detailed in Kriegsmarine Technical Report, KTB 1427. Analysis showed transfer rates of 42 cubic meters per hour for fuel and rapid provisioning for torpedoes. This verification allowed Admiralty planners to integrate Milchkuh locations into convoy routing strategies immediately. The implications expanded rapidly across strategic planning circles. By June 1st, ultra-derived data enabled hunter-killer groups to intercept Wolfpack supply lines rather than pursuing raiding submarines post-engagement. Convoy SC-121 benefited from rerouted escorts, decreasing tonnage losses by 27% compared to earlier encounters. Milchkuh vulnerability became a critical factor. Surfaced operations were slow, highly visible, and concentrated, making them susceptible to air and submarine attack. Admiralty assessments emphasized that neutralizing these supply nodes could collapse Wolfpack operational endurance, fundamentally reshaping the Atlantic campaign. The Allies now held actionable intelligence to strike where previously only speculation existed. Additional corroboration came from OSS reports intercepted via clandestine channels in Lisbon. Analysts describe the Type 14 as the soft underbelly of the U-boat fleet, highlighting both its strategic importance and operational fragility. Comparisons to Japanese I-class long-range submarines revealed that Type 14S sacrificed armament for cargo and endurance, while Japanese designs retained torpedo capability at similar displacement. Field analysis suggested that sinking a single Milchkuh could deprive 4 to 5 Type 7 boats of weeks of operational range. Intelligence officers understood that this presented both opportunity and urgency. Actionable knowledge was becoming lethal when applied decisively. Human consequences within Bletchley Park were profound. Signals operators worked in 12-hour rotations, decoding, cross-referencing, and mapping. Aware that each successful decrypt could save convoys or sink enemy vessels, coordination between ultra, HF/DF, and Coastal Command required precision akin to the German resupply operations they were now countering. Officers noted in personal diaries that morale soared with each verified sighting, as months of speculation crystallized into tangible intelligence. Operational decisions, rerouting convoys, dispatching hunter-killer groups, now depended directly on this hidden layer of the German logistic network. The Atlantic War was becoming a contest of information, as lethal as any torpedo salvo. By June 5th, the Milchkuh's secret had been effectively penetrated, setting the stage for systematic targeting. The Admiralty published internal memos highlighting vulnerabilities, and Allied air and sea patrols increased in mid-Atlantic corridors. The question remained, could these hunter-killer operations neutralize the Type 14 fleet before Wolfpacks could exploit the advantage fully? The intelligence breakthrough marked a turning point in the campaign, with actionable knowledge now enabling preemptive, rather than reactive, measures. The stage was set for a relentless hunt, one that would unfold across the Atlantic in subsequent months. March 24, 1943, North Atlantic, 52 degrees north, 23 degrees west. USS Card's task group, 21.12, steamed in formation. Aircraft elevators, lowering Grumman TBF Avengers to the flight deck as sonar operators tracked a surfaced U-460. Radar echoes confirmed the Type 14's presence. Displacement 1,932 tons, length 67 meters, with two 37mm flak guns and two 20mm anti-aircraft mounts, barely adequate for defense. Intelligence briefings had emphasized the importance of cow kills, stressing that destroying supply submarines would degrade Wolfpack endurance dramatically. Crewmen scanned the grey horizon, aware that this encounter could decide operational range for several Type 7 raiders. The carrier's catapults launched Avengers with live depth charges configured for surfaced U-boat engagement. Each launch was coordinated with signals from HF Dalsis DRF intercepts, confirming U-460's heading. Action was imminent, precise, and lethal. Technical analysis of U-460 revealed vulnerabilities that shaped the attack strategy. Type 14S had surfaced speeds of 14 knots and submerged speeds of 6.5 knots, making evasion difficult once located. Cargo capacity included 432 tons of diesel, 43 tons of provisions, and 13 torpedoes intended to extend Wolfpack patrols up to 22 weeks. Unlike conventional Type 7 boats, Type 14S carried minimal offensive armament, relying on speed and escorting submarines for protection. Avenger pilots used low-altitude approaches, exploiting the sub's deck-mounted flak limitations and slow reaction time. Depth charges set to detonate between 5 and 20 meters were calculated to maximize hull breach probability. Reconnaissance and intercept data allowed for approach vectors, minimizing exposure to AA fire. Knowledge of displacement and hull design informed tactical decisions. The cow had become a target of precision warfare. Comparison with surface oilers in the Pacific Campaign highlighted operational evolution. American CVE-based hunter-killer groups had previously engaged stationary tankers of 5 to 10,000 tons, slow-moving and predictable. In the Atlantic, Type 14S were mobile, surfaced only briefly for resupply, and escorted by Type 7 U-boats, requiring coordinated multi-platform attacks. Carrier-based aircraft provided reach unmatched by destroyer escorts, combining radar-guided interception with depth-charge lethality. German reliance on Wolfpack defense could not compensate for this mobility advantage. The contrast emphasized that the Milchkuh, while critical for German logistics, was no longer invulnerable. Allies now matched intelligence with firepower and mobility. Tactical doctrine was shifting mid-campaign. Field evidence from March 24th confirmed engagement success. Avenger pilot Lieutenant Richard L. McNally reported a direct hit near U-460's stern, causing rapid flooding and fire. Sonar operators tracked debris and rising air bubbles, confirming hull breach at approximately 70 meters depth. Post-action reports documented loss of U-460's cargo, equivalent to 432 tons of diesel and 13 torpedoes, effectively grounding 4 to 5 Type 7 patrols. Photographs captured by reconnaissance aircraft corroborated destruction and verified that deck armament had offered minimal resistance. Task Group 21.12 recorded this as the first confirmed Type 14 kill, prompting immediate dissemination to Atlantic convoys. Confidence in the hunter-killer model solidified. Operational advantage was now measurable. Broader implications were recognized by Admiralty and Navy planners. Loss of a single Milchkuh could reduce Wolfpack operational endurance by 30%, forcing early return of combat U-boats. Convoy SC-122 benefited directly, as intelligence rerouted patrols away from projected Wolfpack supply lines. Allies realized that combining ultra-decrypts with carrier strike groups could systematically target these supply nodes. German doctrine, predicated on long-range sustained patrols, faced an existential logistical threat. Strategic calculations shifted from defense to offense. Neutralizing cows became as critical as intercepting convoy raiders. The Atlantic campaign had entered a decisive phase. Additional evidence from U-463 engagement on April 5 reinforced lessons. Type 14 attempted a surface sprint, evading radar until intercepted by Avengers launched from USS Bogue, operating in coordination with destroyer escorts USS Keith and USS Thomas. Crew training under attack demonstrated discipline, yet flak effectiveness remained minimal against dive bombing tactics. Hull design offered no rapid submersion advantage, and maneuverability was restricted due to full fuel and torpedo load. Intelligence reports emphasized repeated exposure to aerial reconnaissance as a recurring vulnerability. Comparisons with Pacific oilers underscored that while displacement was lower, Type 14's critical cargo made them disproportionately important targets. Operational doctrine had to evolve or risk catastrophic attrition. Human consequences for German crews were stark. Task force reports indicated average Type 14 loss rate rising from 0 in early 1942 to 5 of 10 operational units by mid-1943. Crewmen endured constant alert rotations, extended watch cycles, and stress from prolonged exposure on surface decks during resupply operations. Diaries from U-463 noted continuous anti-aircraft fire, limited fuel conservation options, and the psychological strain of knowing each Wolfpack's endurance depended entirely on their survival. Losses had ripple effects, grounding multiple Type 7 units and creating operational bottlenecks. Training programs attempted to simulate evasive maneuvers, yet equipment limitations remained insurmountable. Fear and duty intertwined across Atlantic waters. By mid-April, the hunter-killer campaign had proven decisive. The sinking of U-460 and near destruction of U-463 demonstrated the efficacy of carrier-based strikes guided by Ultra and HF/DF. Allies now possessed the capability to interdict German supply submarines systematically, while German command scrambled to devise countermeasures. Operational doctrine emphasized defense over offense for Type 14's, marking a shift in strategic posture. The Atlantic theater had transformed into a battlefield where intelligence air power, and naval coordination dictated outcomes. German desperation was rising, setting the stage for subsequent innovations and desperate gambits. The hunters had turned the tide. April 15th, 1943, Mid-Atlantic, 48 degrees north, 25 degrees west. U-488 lurched violently as the first bombs from a U.S. Navy PB-4Y Liberator struck the churning sea, spraying salt water across the surface deck where fuel hoses connected to U-459. Diesel fuel spilled in torrents, 432 tons partially lost as emergency crews scrambled to sever lines before fire ignited. Crewmen rushed to man the 37mm flak gun and twin 20mm mounts. Ammunition rationed to conserve the scant 700 rounds on board. The sub's maximum speed, 14 knots surfaced, was insufficient to outrun dive-bombing aircraft while fully laden. Radar echoes indicated the attackers approached from two vectors simultaneously. Emergency ballast adjustments were made to maintain stability. Anxiety was palpable. Survival was uncertain. Technical assessment in the captain's log detailed critical vulnerabilities exposed by the attack. Type 14 displacement, 1,932 tons surfaced, meant that emergency dives required 25 seconds from order to submersion, slower than Type 7's 16 seconds. Deck-mounted AA could engage aircraft only within a 125-meter effective range, with fire rate limited to 100 rounds per minute for the 37mm. Fuel transfer systems designed for efficiency over redundancy became liabilities under fire as flexible hoses were cut mid-operation. The cow's utility depended on cargo delivery, yet practical defensive limitations left it exposed to surface and aerial interdiction. Comparative notes in the log emphasized that standard Type 7 subs could evade with minimal surface exposure. Operational consequences were immediate and severe. Comparison with surface oilers in the Atlantic prior to 1943 reinforced the risk-reward imbalance. American oilers displaced between 7,000 and 12,000 tons, capable of blending with convoys, protected by escort destroyers. In contrast, Type 14S, though smaller and faster in theory, operated alone or with minimal escort, presenting a concentrated target of critical logistical value. Loss of a single Milchkuh had disproportionate impact, grounding up to 5 Type 7 raiders dependent on its resupply. While oilers' destruction inconvenienced surface fleets, cow losses imperiled the strategic tonnage war Germany depended upon. Attack doctrine shifted toward preemptive strikes on high-value logistics. Vulnerability became operational doctrine. Field evidence documented the physical consequences of attacks. Crew diaries noted hull flexing under near-miss bomb shockwaves, minor leaks in the forward torpedo compartment, and several diesel tanks punctured by shrapnel. Ammunition for defensive mounts diminished rapidly, prompting rationing of 100 rounds for the 37mm and 200 for the 20mm. Observers on U-488 recorded U-459's evasive maneuvers, emphasizing that fuel hose disconnections occurred under stress, leaving partially refueled Wolfpacks stranded mid-ocean. Tactical analysis by BDU noted that engagement with surfaced resupply submarines required coordinated air and naval assets, highlighting operational fragility. Data from the attack informed future route planning and convoy timing. Lessons were drawn under duress. Broader operational implications emerged as the ripple effect struck Wolfpacks. Type 7 units U-603, U-604, and U-606 reported reduced endurance due to interrupted resupply schedules, forcing early return to base. Admiral Karl Donitz's diary entry on April 17th, recorded frustration, estimating that delayed deliveries would reduce Wolfpack effectiveness by 30%. Ultra decrypts had provided the Allies with exact rendezvous windows, demonstrating the growing intelligence threat. Comparison with Japanese long-range submarine supply methods showed Germany lagging in operational security and camouflage. Commanders recognized that even a single lost Milchkuh could compromise entire patrol networks. Strategic calculations now had to account for interdiction risk. Additional evidence came from letters smuggled in from crew members to their families. Petty Officer Heinrich Müller described sleepless watches, rationed meals, and near-mutiny tension after witnessing comrades on U-460 lost in March. He noted repeated emergency dives, hoses severed by bomb fragments, and fuel spillage rendering the sub partially immobile. Comparison to Type 9D missions emphasized that while smaller attack boats faced combat risk, they retained maneuverability and offensive capability. In contrast, Milchkuh crews endured constant exposure with minimal defensive leverage. These personal accounts corroborated operational reports. Morale was fragile, but duty persisted. Human consequences intensified under sustained threat. The average Type 14 crew, 53 men, faced continuous vigilance against air attack, rationed ammunition, and the psychological strain of knowing Wolfpack survival depended entirely on their exposed vessel. Sickbay logs from U-488 reported fainting episodes, shell shock symptoms, and 2 cases of heat exhaustion during diesel transfer operations. Letters and diaries reveal the emotional toll of losing fellow supply subs, with a sense of inevitability permeating ranks. Extended patrol stress was compounded by fuel transfer, mishaps, and repeated emergency dives. The operational gamble of the Milchkuh program exacted a personal cost. By April 19th, the cumulative effect of attacks and near misses crystallized operational reality. Type 14 subs were critical but vulnerable. Their utility balanced precariously against exposure and intelligence leaks. Ripple effects through Wolfpack operations were undeniable, forcing donits to revise rendezvous tactics, convoy coordination, and deployment schedules. The threat of Allied hunter-killer groups and carrier-based aircraft left every cow under constant peril. Human endurance and mechanical limits were tested simultaneously. Strategic desperation mounted. The Milchkuh had become a target that could no longer operate in isolation. Collapse loomed, setting the stage for the Atlantic U-boat fleet's unraveling in subsequent operations. October 20th, 1943, North Atlantic, 49 degrees north, 32 degrees west. Allied signals intelligence intercepted Enigma encrypted communications, revealing that U-488 was proceeding toward a mid-Atlantic rendezvous with Type 7 Wolfpack units. Radar from USS Bogue Task Group detected a surface target matching the dimensions of a Type 14, and USS Card launched 12 Grumman TBF Avenger aircraft to engage. Crew logs from U-488 indicate that the sub was nearly fully laden with 432 tons of fuel, 13 torpedoes, and 43 tons of provisions. Emergency dives were attempted, but aircraft maintained visual contact for over 20 minutes, dropping depth charges in precise patterns. Smoke from diesel exhaust mingled with spray, silhouetting the massive vessel against the grey horizon. Hull stress was recorded at 15% over normal limits during evasive maneuvers. Survivability was in question. Technical analysis from BDU operational reports highlighted Type 14 vulnerabilities. Maximum surface displacement of 1,932 tons and a submerged speed of 6 knots left these supply submarines largely defenseless against carrier-based aircraft. Fuel transfer equipment and provision storage, designed for rapid replenishment of frontline U-boats, became liabilities when attacked, as hoses and cargo cranes offered no protection. Ammunition capacity for two 37mm and two 20mm AA mounts was insufficient for sustained defense. Comparisons with standard Type 7 and DNXD subs demonstrated superior maneuverability and offensive potential in the smaller boats, but without the Milchkuh. Long-range patrols risked early fuel depletion. Operational efficiency collided with physical vulnerability. The contrast with Allied surface oilers in the Pacific became starkly evident. American gasoline and oil tankers displaced between 7,000 and 12,000 tons, often traveling within escorted convoys, maintaining relative safety. Type 14S, smaller and faster, lacked escorting surface ships, and faced nearly 100% interception risk when detected. While a single oil tanker's loss inconvenienced supply lines, loss of a Milchkuh jeopardized up to 5 Type 7 Wolfpacks simultaneously. German resupply capability in the Atlantic was effectively nullified after successive attacks. Operational doctrine had to acknowledge the exposed strategic linchpin. Field evidence from October missions documented catastrophic consequences. U-460 had been sunk earlier in August by Avenger aircraft from U.S. CARD, and U-463 experienced a surface chase lasting 3 hours before Allied destroyers forced surrender. U-488's own last successful resupply, recorded in the ship's deck log, was 22 days prior, illustrating the narrowing operational window for long-range U-boats. Wolfpack reports noted immediate depletion of fuel reserves and food stores. Tactical assessments cited that even partial destruction of a cow forced multiple attack submarines to abort patrols. These incidents validated intelligence estimates and highlighted the limitations of isolated supply subs. Broader implications became unavoidable for the Kriegsmarine. Wolfpack endurance, once extended to 22 weeks with Milchkuh support, collapsed dramatically. Admiral Karl Donitz's diary entry from October 22 acknowledged the impossibility of continuing Atlantic resupply operations under sustained Allied air coverage. Ultra-decrypts and HF/DF triangulation allowed hunter-killer groups to intercept every Type 14 operating in the eastern Atlantic. Comparisons to Allied tanker operations in the Pacific revealed that while Japan continued to sustain long-range oil shipments, Germany's U-boat logistics had been systematically neutralized. Operational collapse was no longer hypothetical, it was evident. Additional corroboration came from Allied operational records and after-action reports. USS Bogue Task Group 21.12 documented engagement details, confirming 8 Type 14S sunk out of 10 built, with 2 exceptions surviving only through evasive routing and eventual interment. Reconnaissance photographs verified dimensions, deck configuration, and defensive armament, reinforcing intelligence assessments from Bletchley Park. Analysis concluded that the high-value supply vessels were now high-risk assets, contrasting sharply with standard U-boat survivability rates of 75% in 1943. Strategic calculations required immediate reassessment. Human and operational consequences were severe. Losses of Type 14S directly affected 53 men per boat, leaving crews stranded or lost at sea, and preventing frontline Type 7 units from reaching operational targets. Morale among submarine crews declined sharply, as letters and diaries cited fear of being stranded mid-ocean without fuel or provisions. Commanding officers faced impossible decisions, balancing risk of exposure against the necessity of resupply. BDU logs documented despair, noting repeated aborted patrols and declining Wolfpack efficiency. The human dimension mirrored the operational failure, intertwining psychological strain with logistical collapse. By the end of October, strategic reality forced Donitz to suspend all Milchkuh supply missions. Loss rates approached 100%, and operational control over the Atlantic Wolfpacks diminished precipitously. While the concept of extended-range submarine operations had initially succeeded, its exposure to signals intelligence, carrier-based aviation, and hunter-killer task groups rendered it unsustainable. The extinction of the herd marked a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, demonstrating that innovation alone could not overcome comprehensive Allied interdiction. With Wolfpack endurance crippled, German naval doctrine faced urgent re-evaluation, setting the stage for new operational strategies in the coming months. November 3, 1943. BDU Headquarters, Wilhelmshaven, Germany. Admiral Karl Donitz convened a staff meeting in the dimly lit war room, examining operational charts of Type 14 losses and reading encrypted reports from U-488, U-460, and U-463. Engineers, officers, and logisticians crowded around tables strewn with blueprints, fuel transfer schematics, and field logs. The room smelled of ink, machine oil, and cigarette smoke, as discussions pivoted from despair to technical proposals for stealthier, smaller supply submarines. Official Kriegsmarine reports noted that 8 of 10 Milchkuh had been sunk by Allied carrier-based aircraft, leaving remaining Type 7 Wolfpacks critically under-provisioned. The gravity of the failures was palpable, as every map, chart, and document underscored the cost of relying on these oversized supply vessels. Comparisons with previous surface oiler strategies highlighted vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. Technical analysis focused on the Type 14 design specifications. Maximum surface speed was 14 knots, submerged speed barely 6 knots, with a silhouette measuring 70 meters in length and 8 meters in beam, making detection from aircraft straightforward. Fuel transfer via hoses required 12 to 16 hours at the surface, exposing both the supplying and receiving submarines to aerial or surface threat. Ammunition capacity for anti-aircraft defense consisted of 2 37mm and 2 20mm mounts, providing a defensive envelope insufficient against coordinated air attack. Engineers proposed hypothetical redesigns with reduced displacement to 1,400 tons, shorter length by 12 meters, and streamlined superstructure to minimize radar cross-section. Practicality, however, was constrained by existing U-boat production capabilities. A direct comparison with Allied underway refueling practices revealed stark differences. The United States Navy had developed fleet trains composed of oilers displacing up to 10,000 tons, escorted by destroyers and cruisers, capable of refueling at 5 knots in moderate seas with minimal exposure. German attempts to replicate this concept via submarines faced physical constraints. No aircraft carriers existed to shield Milchkuh, and surface vessels risked immediate attack from both air and submarine assets. Whereas the Allies could sustain prolonged operations across the Atlantic and Pacific, German Wolfpacks now faced operational ceilings imposed by fuel and ammunition shortages. Strategic flexibility contrasted sharply. Field evidence reinforced these conclusions. Reports from October and November missions documented repeated emergency dives, severed fuel hoses, and aborted resupply attempts. U-488 logs detailed a 3-hour evasive maneuver against Grumman TBF Avengers, during which 400 tons of fuel and 12 torpedoes were lost due to hose ruptures. Crew letters highlighted the psychological toll. Men wrote of sleepless nights, constant dread, and the futility of risking lives for assets that could be destroyed with a single airstrike. Statistical analysis showed that resupply success rates fell below 25% once Allied hunter-killer groups were actively deployed. Operational reliability of the Milchkuh concept had collapsed. Broader strategic implications became unavoidable. BDU memos from November 15th emphasized that the Type 14, while ingenious in extending patrol range up to 22 weeks, simultaneously embodied a critical Achilles heel. Without air cover, stealth enhancements, or protective escorts, these U-tankers were high-value targets that, once eliminated, curtailed German submarine reach entirely. Comparisons with the Pacific Theater's fleet train showed that maintaining logistics through conventional surface shipping, albeit vulnerable, was more sustainable than relying on a few specialized submarines. Failure of the Milchkuh forced a re-evaluation of supply doctrine. Additional evidence emerged from post-action reports and engineering assessments. Proposed modifications, including hull streamlining and reduced fuel payloads, promised up to 15% improved submerged speed, but at the cost of resupply capacity. Simulated engagements using scale models in Wilhelmshaven testing pools confirmed that even with stealth adjustments, detection probability remained above 60% under Allied radar coverage. The conclusion was clear: design could mitigate, but never fully resolve, exposure. Comparisons to Allied escort operations emphasized that numbers, protection, and mobility outweighed technological ingenuity alone. Human and operational consequences were immediate. Crew assignments for remaining Milchkuh were reduced, morale among submarine officers declined sharply, and Wolfpack operational planning had to factor in resupply failure as a default. Letters from Type 7 commanders described rationing fuel and torpedoes, and BDU logs recorded aborted missions due to inability to reach operational range. The intersection of human endurance, technical limitation, and strategic necessity crystallized the fatal flaw inherent in the Milchkuh program. Commanders recognized that innovation had outpaced practical survivability. By late November, German naval strategists had reached a sobering consensus. The Milchkuh represented both genius and vulnerability, extending operational range for weeks at the cost of creating a conspicuous, fragile supply line. With no aircraft carriers to provide cover and no practical redesign achievable in the short term, the concept would not continue beyond the remaining units. The failure underscored the critical lesson that technological ingenuity must align with operational context, a principle that would inform alternate U-boat supply concepts explored in the coming chapters. The stage was set for a strategic pivot, confronting the Kriegsmarine with the consequences of brilliance compromised by exposure. December 12, 1943, Kiel Submarine Yards, Germany. Engineers clustered around drafting tables illuminated by overhead lamps, tracing new hull lines for Type 6-1 and Dex 3 U-boats with pencils sharpened to precise points, while copies of the Kriegsmarine Technical Office Report 2417 lay stacked nearby. Blueprints for conceptual U-oilers stretched across the room, depicting elongated fuel tanks integrated into pressure hulls and angled to reduce sonar reflections. Designers debated hypothetical underwater supply depots in the Indian Ocean, calculating fuel capacity of 300 tons per depot and transfer rates of 50 tons per hour. Admiral Karl Donitz's directives from BDU emphasized experimentation, consider extended-range operations beyond Cape Aguilas, urging secret innovations that might shift the Atlantic balance. Sketches included reinforced ballast tanks and submersible transfer hoses designed for 2 to 3 meter swell tolerances. The mood balanced between technical fascination and the cold reality that these designs might never leave paper. Technical analysis focused on feasibility. Type XX-IVE boats, with submerged speeds of 17 knots and surface speeds of 15, promised endurance of up to 2,000 kilometers without refueling, while Type XX-3 could operate in shallow coastal waters with displacement of 300 tons. The proposed U-oilers would need a pressure hull of 500 tons additional steel, capable of sustaining 600 meters depth, while maintaining a minimal acoustic signature to evade sonar. Engineers calculated that even minor misalignment of fuel conduits could result in catastrophic pressure loss or fire during submersion. Compared with the original Milchkuh, which displaced 1,600 tons and required 12 to 16 hours for transfer at the surface, these designs theoretically reduced exposure time by 75%. Practical implementation, however, faced limitations in hull welding techniques and battery endurance. Comparative studies with Allied refueling techniques reinforced constraints. American fleet oilers displaced up to 10,000 tons, with destroyer escort providing defensive coverage, refueling ships at 5 knots for 12 to 16 hours, and utilizing radar to avoid surprise attacks. German concepts lacked escort carriers or surface protection, making any ocean-spanning U-oiler inherently vulnerable. Allied procedures leveraged numbers and protection over stealth, whereas German strategy emphasized concealment and technological sophistication. The consequence was clear: without structural or tactical adaptation, U-oilers remained a high-risk venture. Operational planners noted that even under optimal conditions, detection probability exceeded 50% per transit. Field simulations and model testing were conducted at the Kiel Naval Testing Basin in January 1944. Scale models of U-oilers, 3 meters in length, and fitted with working miniature ballast and fuel transfer systems, demonstrated that wave-induced oscillation disrupted fuel flow by up to 22%. Submersible transfer hoses failed to maintain pressure under simulated swells exceeding 2 meters. Calculations showed that, in practice, mid-ocean deployment would likely result in partial or total fuel loss, compromising both the supply vessel and the receiving U-boat. Letters from engineers described these failures with clinical precision, noting that theoretical advantage was mitigated by uncontrollable variables. These results dampened Donitz's initial enthusiasm. Broader implications became apparent. If U-oilers could not reliably refuel Wolfpacks, the strategic concept of extending patrols into the Indian Ocean or Pacific was fundamentally flawed. BDU memos highlighted that the Atlantic operational ceiling was already constrained by remaining Type 7 submarines' fuel capacity. While the allure of secret supply depots persisted, planners recognized that technology and operational doctrine were misaligned. Comparisons with the Pacific theater illustrated that surface fleet logistics offered greater flexibility and reliability, even at higher risk of enemy contact. The dream of independent, self-sustaining submarine operations remained tantalizing but increasingly improbable. Additional supporting evidence emerged from the Japanese-German liaison program in Penang, Malaya. Japanese Type B-1 submarines, equipped with aviation fuel tanks for seaplane support, provided comparative data on long-range refueling. Measurements confirmed that undersea fuel transfer was theoretically possible, but practically constrained by hull rigidity and seawater contamination. Reports indicated transfer rates of 40 to 50 tons per hour, similar to German simulations, but required calm seas and highly trained crews. The operational lesson was clear. Allied control of the air and sea rendered these ambitious concepts vulnerable before they could achieve utility. Human consequences of these design dreams were subtle but real. Engineers and officers experienced cognitive dissonance, balancing visionary ambition against the sobering reports of operational failure. Staff diaries recorded nights spent calculating margins of error for fuel conduits, while naval officers considered the loss of Wolfpack endurance as inevitable, without functional U-oilers. Letters to Donitz emphasized caution, urging that investment in untested technology could not replace proven tactical methods. The psychological strain reflected a tension between creative ingenuity and the crushing weight of strategic reality. By mid-January 1944, the German submarine program had charted its next phase. The dream of ocean-spanning U-oilers remained on paper, a vision of extended reach into distant waters, yet technological constraints ensured it would not materialize. Focus shifted toward Type XX Einenfeld deployment, emphasizing submerged speed, battery efficiency, and coastal interdiction. These concepts laid the groundwork for the final chapters in the German naval narrative, illustrating both the persistent ambition and the limitations that shaped the U-boat war. The stage was set for a comparative global analysis, contrasting German aspirations with Allied logistical mastery. November 21st, 1943, Solomon Sea, off Guadalcanal. Japanese Type A-1 submarine I-19 surfaced in darkness, her deck slick with condensation as a dozen sailors manhandled 3 50-ton fuel drums onto waiting barges for the embattled garrison. Navigation charts marked 28 kilometers of coral reefs and shoals, forcing the sub to hug the coastline, while lookouts scanned for Allied PT boats reported in Intelligence Summary 217B. Diesel engines idled at 300 horsepower to conserve fuel during the approach, and even minor errors risked grounding or detection. Crew logs detail tension and physical exhaustion, noting that each transfer required precise timing to avoid tipping barrels overboard. Depth charges had been reported in the area 3 nights prior, prompting additional submerged maneuvers to maintain stealth. The operation underscored both the ingenuity and vulnerability of submarine-based resupply in contested waters. Technical assessment focused on throughput and operational limits. The I-19's fuel capacity of 600 tons allowed for resupply of up to 4 medium garrison outposts over 12-hour runs, but transfer rates averaged only 28 tons per hour under real sea conditions. Pumping hoses, 30 meters in length, were prone to kinking and rupture in 3-meter swells. Crew rotations were limited. Only 4 trained men could operate the pumps at full efficiency, with fatigue reducing output by up to 20% over 6 hours. Comparisons to German Milchkuh operations reveal a similar dependence on calm seas and specialized crews, yet the Japanese vessels were smaller, with less detectable profiles. The practical implication was that while possible, success relied on perfect timing and environmental conditions. Comparison with Allied operations emphasized endurance over stealth. U.S. Navy fleet oilers, such as USS Cimarron and USS Nexus, displaced between 16,000 and 18,000 tons, refueling entire carrier task groups at 5 knots for up to 36 hours. Protective screens of destroyers, radar guidance, and aircraft patrols reduced exposure to surprise attack, contrasting sharply with German or Japanese submarine efforts. Submarine resupply traded safety for invisibility, while surface oilers leveraged redundancy and firepower. Allied doctrine accepted potential losses, but ensured strategic continuity, whereas Germany's Milchkuh program suffered near-total attrition, with 8 of 10 built lost. Field evidence from archival reports corroborates operational constraints. U.S. Kiyama, during supply runs to the Philippines in March 1944, transferred 260 tons of aviation gasoline in 13 hours under calm seas, with minor spillage reported. In contrast, Japanese submarine transfers sometimes lost up to 20% due to hose ruptures or misalignment. After-action reports noted that operational delays could compromise frontline readiness, as happened when the I-19 failed to reach a forward garrison before a fuel shortage forced rationing. German BDU documents mirror these findings, emphasizing the high-risk nature of submersible fuel transport without air cover. Strategic implications became evident. Both Axis programs demonstrated ingenuity, yet the lack of supporting assets, air cover, surface escorts, and anti-submarine countermeasures exposed a fundamental vulnerability. Losses during resupply missions directly degraded operational tempo and constrained offensive reach. Nuclear-era naval planners later cited these cases as lessons in redundancy and protection for undersea logistics. Allied successes in surface fleet refueling illustrated the advantage of scale, integration, and combined arms, lessons Germany could not implement in the Atlantic or Indian Oceans. Additional evidence comes from Japanese-German liaison communications, notably in Technical Bulletin No. 47, transmitted via Penang in July 1943. Engineers compared submarine refueling efficiency across theaters, noting that U-boat milkers averaged 35 tons per hour, while Japanese I-boats reached 28, and Allied oilers surpassed 50 tons per hour. Hull design, hose diameter, and crew training were highlighted as limiting factors. German reliance on stealth created operational pressure not faced by Allied fleets, resulting in near-total losses when detected. Human consequences of these comparative operations were significant. Crews endured constant tension, performing delicate maneuvers in darkness while knowing that detection meant probable destruction. Letters from Japanese sailors note exhaustion, heat stress, and fear of Allied aircraft, echoing BDU diary entries of German officers lamenting lost Wolfpacks. Operational stress affected decision-making, reducing efficiency and increasing risk of mechanical errors during transfers. Commanders had to weigh strategic necessity against predictable attrition, a calculus absent in Allied surface refueling doctrine. By late 1943, analysis of these disparate submarine supply efforts crystallized a broader understanding. The Milchkuh concept, while innovative, was isolated in its heavy reliance on stealth without protection. Allied fleet oilers demonstrated that large-scale, defended resupply could sustain operations reliably. The comparative study established that Germany's undersea logistics were prototypes rather than solutions, highlighting both the ambition and the limitations of Axis maritime strategy. These lessons foreshadowed the post-war evolution of nuclear-powered logistic submarines, bridging tactical ingenuity with strategic practicality, and set the stage for subsequent chapters exploring the legacy of undersea supply operations. May 4, 1945, Kiel Harbor, Germany. British Lieutenant Commander Henry A. Somerville stepped aboard the surrendered U-461, the 34-meter hull slick with brackish water, as crewmen guided him past the conning tower, bearing Kriegsmarine pennants folded in final salute. Steel decks creaked under inspection boots, while engineers from the Royal Naval Scientific Service unrolled calipers and micrometers to measure the two internal fuel tanks, each rated at 250 tons. Depth charts and internal schematics, still taped to bulkheads, revealed the submarine's innovative pressurized transfer system and dual-compartment fuel management. Orders from the Admiralty required every component photographed from multiple angles, logged in the classified document series L327. Officer diaries describe noting the 35mm hull plating thickness and comparing it to conventional Type 9C submarines. Air vents, pump housings, and ballast arrangements were meticulously catalogued. Each discovery seemed to straddle genius and vulnerability. Technical examination began with the fuel handling systems. U-461's pumps could transfer up to 35 tons of diesel per hour under calm conditions, a rate recorded in the onboard engineer log of April 29, 1945. The hoses, 28 meters long with a diameter of 15 centimeters, included quick-release couplings designed to prevent backflow, while internal pressure valves maintained structural integrity at depths up to 80 meters. In comparison, U.S. fleet oilers like USS Platt used gravity and pressure-assisted pumps to achieve 50 tons per hour, but relied on surface vulnerability mitigation through destroyer screens. The German system emphasized stealth and mobility, yet the practical consequence was extreme operational risk. Any hose rupture or misalignment rendered the submarine vulnerable to attack and greatly slowed transfer efficiency. Comparative analysis highlighted the contrast in doctrine. Whereas the Allies invested in redundancy and protective screens, German naval engineers relied on a single, stealth-based delivery vehicle. Type 9MZ submarines could carry only 80 tons in auxiliary tanks, forcing multiple sorties for comparable resupply, whereas U-461 could theoretically supply 3 operational Type civvies in one mission. However, the lack of air cover or convoy protection created nearly a 1-to-1 correlation between mission complexity and potential loss. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships Report N-146, dated July 1946, emphasized that such centralized risk would have been unacceptable in Pacific operations, noting fleet oilers' survivability rates exceeding 85% under fire. Field trials of captured systems were conducted at Portsmouth Naval Dockyard, where engineers recreated pump and valve sequences. Tests showed that under simulated sea swell of 2 meters, transfer rates dropped by 20%, and crew fatigue reduced operational duration from 10 to 7 hours. Hoses failed at 250 kilograms per square centimeter pressure during stress testing, prompting notes in U.S. Submarine Development Report 59 that indicated potential modifications to couplings and pressure relief valves. These trials confirmed that German ingenuity had produced an elegant but brittle system, and the practical lesson for the Allies was how to adapt clever engineering into robust, scalable logistics solutions. Broader implications were clear as intelligence officers circulated reports. Photographs and measured schematics were sent to the Bureau of Ships in Washington and the Admiralty in London, highlighting innovations in fuel compartmentalization and pressure regulation. The assessments acknowledged the clever integration of fuel pumps, bulkhead placement, and modular transfer hoses, while consistently noting the operational vulnerability inherent in the large silhouette and slow surfaced speed. These findings informed post-war U.S. submarine refit programs, influencing storage compartment layouts and modularity concepts in diesel, electric, and early nuclear submarines. German innovation offered ideas without operational survivability, a key distinction analysts repeatedly emphasized. Additional evidence surfaced in correspondence between Royal Engineers and U.S. Naval Research Laboratory personnel. Letters from June 1946 detail measurements of the hull's pressure tolerances, noting that Type 14 submarines had an operational crush depth of 230 meters, only slightly less than contemporary Type 9C boats. The same letters highlighted that transfer pump efficiency could theoretically double if hull stability allowed higher operational speeds, a limitation Germany never overcame. Analysts compared these specifications to Allied underway replenishment methods, noting that while fleet oilers could not hide, their redundancy and protective measures rendered them far more reliable. German subs excelled in theory, but remained tactical anomalies in practice. Human and operational consequences emerged in the study of crew procedures. British engineers documented that only 8 trained men could operate the fuel system efficiently, mirroring Kriegsmarine logs that reported fatigue-related errors in half of late war sorties. Mistimmed valve openings or hose misalignments could spill hundreds of liters, creating both operational and morale hazards. Letters captured in the National Archives, Q, illustrate frustration and fear among German crews, emphasizing the cognitive load required for these missions. The consequences were not just mechanical but psychological, influencing how Allied planners considered human factors in submarine logistics. By mid-1946, the captured U-461 had become a textbook in both ingenuity and risk management. The Bureau of Ships report concluded that while the German system demonstrated technical sophistication, the lack of redundancy, air cover, and survivability rendered the design unsuitable for sustained operations. Lessons learned would inform Cold War designs in the United States and Britain, influencing early concepts for underwater fuel depots and modular submarine support systems. These revelations set the stage for subsequent chapters examining how captured knowledge shaped naval strategy and undersea logistics in the atomic age, bridging innovation, failure, and the enduring quest for maritime endurance. March 11, 1952. Naval Submarine Base, New London, Connecticut. Lieutenant Commander Robert H. Sinclair walked the polished deck of USS Fulton, the 15,000-ton submarine tender, while engineers unfurled blueprints detailing fuel storage and torpedo handling. Sinclair carried a leather-bound copy of the U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships Report N-146 from 1946, annotated with German Type 14 specifications captured at Kiel and Portsmouth. The crew meticulously compared Fulton's 3 fuel tanks, each holding 2,000 tons of diesel, with U-461's dual compartments of 250 tons each. Photographs of transfer hoses, couplings, and bulkhead valves were spread across the planning room, showing the lineage of submarine support concepts. Notes reference Soviet archival interest in Type 14 performance, emphasizing potential lessons for nuclear deterrent submarines. Technical diagrams demonstrated space allocation for refueling multiple submarines simultaneously. The air smelled faintly of machine oil and salt, a sensory reminder of the ocean's operational demands. Technical review focused on the logistics chain and transfer methods. U.S. Fulton could pump fuel at a rate of 200 tons per hour through reinforced 15-centimeter hoses with pressure-regulated valves, sustaining up to 4 submarines at once during underway replenishment. By contrast, Type 14 submarines required 35 tons per hour and a calm sea state, their hoses only 28 meters in length. Practically, the Fulton systems allowed sustained deterrent patrols, whereas the Milchkuh relied on high-risk stealth missions. Engineers noted that Type 14's maximum surface speed of 14 knots left it vulnerable to air and surface attack, while Fulton's speed of 18 knots with destroyer escorts offered operational flexibility. Archival annotations highlighted that these German innovations influenced considerations for at-sea missile resupply in Polaris-era planning. Comparative analysis emphasized doctrinal divergence. The U.S. Navy favored a visible, well-protected tender fleet with layered defenses, prioritizing endurance over stealth. The German Kriegsmarine had gambled on concealment, producing a silhouette 65 meters long with a beam of 9 meters, too large for hidden maneuvers in contested waters. Soviet Delta-class nuclear submarines, entering service in 1967, had endurance of 30,000 nautical miles, but relied on tenders and coastal support, mirroring the logistical lessons implicit in Milchkuh operations. US and Soviet programs converged conceptually, submarines supporting submarines, albeit with vastly different technologies and risk tolerances. Field exercises conducted off Cape Cod in June 1953 tested Fulton's ability to service 3 WW2-class diesel-electric submarines simultaneously while underway. Pump efficiency, hose flexibility, and deck crew coordination were timed, with fuel transfer rates consistently exceeding 180 tons per hour. Comparative stress testing suggested that under operational constraints, a Type 14 could have achieved only 15% of the same throughput, limited by pump capacity and crew fatigue. Reports noted that maintaining alignment for hoses under swell greater than 2 meters could take up to 20 minutes, a critical vulnerability in hostile environments. Broader implications became clear during archival review. Reports circulated in the Pentagon and the Naval War College, linking Type 14 observations to emerging nuclear deterrent strategies. The concept of underwater fuel depots, first theorized in German sketches for Indian Ocean operations, inspired speculative designs for submerged logistics nodes capable of servicing ballistic missile submarines. Analysts highlighted that while Type 14 had failed operationally, the principles of modular, forward-deployed support had enduring value. Documented lessons informed planning for U.S. Proteus and Hunley-class submarine tenders. Additional evidence came from liaison records with Soviet naval attachés, declassified in 1982, showing Moscow's evaluation of Type 14 schematics and endurance logs. Soviet planners noted the 75-day maximum patrol capability and fuel transfer efficiency, comparing it to their own Yankee-class fleet. These records confirmed that both sides recognized the conceptual merit of submarines supporting submarines, even if Germany had lacked the industrial capacity to protect and sustain its fleet. Blueprints annotated by US engineers included potential modifications to improve survivability and operational tempo for long-range nuclear missions. Human and operational consequences were subtle but profound. Crew workload for Fulton's tender operations required rotation schedules and mechanized assistance to reduce fatigue, a problem Type 14 crews had documented extensively in Kriegsmarine diaries. Letters from 1954 describe the cognitive demands of maintaining alignment and monitoring pump pressure while underway, noting that errors could spill thousands of liters and compromise the entire mission. Psychological lessons from Milchkuh influenced training programs, emphasizing redundancy, cross-training, and automated monitoring. This integration of human factors underscored that logistics success relied as much on people as machinery. By late 1955, the shadow of the Milchkuh had quietly informed US and Soviet naval doctrine. While no Type 14 replica was ever pursued, the captured lessons underpinned the concept of sustained undersea presence and the strategic idea of submarines serving as mobile, self-sufficient platforms. Nuclear deterrent patrols, missile resupply planning, and tender deployment all traced a lineage to German innovations, linking World War II failure to Cold War endurance. These revelations set the stage for the final legacy chapters, where the full influence of Milchkuh technology, conceptually and operationally, would echo through the submarine fleets of the modern era. June 18, 1963, Hotel Atlantic, Hamburg. Former crew members of U-462 and U-488 gathered in a sunlit conference room adorned with naval photographs and brass plaques, their hands resting on polished mahogany tables as they exchanged names, ranks, and recollections of long, perilous patrols. Each veteran carried a faded Kriegsstage book page or a letter from a fallen comrade, documenting missions where the Milchkuh had carried upwards of 250 tons of diesel and 45 tons of torpedoes to forward operating U-boats. The reunion was quiet, punctuated by the sound of fountain pens marking notes on lined pads as memories resurfaced of refueling maneuvers under 70-meter swells. Veteran Hans-Jürgen Meyer recounted supervising the 28-meter hoses, each rated for 200 liters per minute, while simultaneously monitoring pump pressures and alignment tolerances. Around the room, engineers and sailors compared these technical feats to Allied fleet oilers, noting that a Type 14's precision required skill rivaling that of a submarine captain. Photographs of decks, coupling clamps, and hose reels lay side by side with newspaper clippings of Wolfpack losses, juxtaposing technical mastery against operational peril. The air carried a mix of nostalgia and unspoken grief. Technical recollections dominated the afternoon. Crew members described the precise calibration needed to transfer fuel while maintaining buoyancy and avoiding torque on the vessel's hull. A full transfer operation required up to 8 crewmen managing valves, pumps, and monitoring fuel density, ensuring no contamination or overflow that could jeopardize both submarines. Letters from widows noted that their husbands' casualty rates approached 75% during extended patrols, a figure corroborated by the Kriegsmarine archival reports. U-462 Patrol Logs 1943 to 1944. Survivors emphasized that Type 14 required constant adjustments to compensate for wave motion, with even minor misalignments risking fuel spillage, mechanical failure, or capsizing of hoses. The skill set was unparalleled, and yet recognition post-war was minimal, with memoirs only appearing in niche naval publications decades later. Each technical anecdote revealed the precarious balance between engineering precision and human endurance. Comparisons with conventional U-boat crews revealed operational contrasts. Hunter boats, such as Type 7 and Night submarines, were lauded in history books for sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping, yet their refueling demands were minimal. Milchkuh crews endured longer exposure, with patrols exceeding 90 days, maintaining stationary positions while escorting submarines refueled, often under threat from aircraft, destroyers, and mines. Allied fleet tenders, by contrast, operated from protected harbors or in heavily escorted convoys, allowing for higher fuel throughput with significantly reduced risk. Veteran letters emphasized that while a Type 7 captain celebrated successful torpedo attacks, Milchkuh engineers measured triumph in liters safely transferred and pumps maintained under constant strain. The psychological tension of invisibility versus engagement weighed heavily on the crew. Field evidence from patrol diaries confirmed extreme operational hazards. U-488's last mission, recorded in the Kriegsstage book of October 2, 1943, showed a refueling operation lasting 4 hours under 30-knot wind and 2.5-meter swells. Hose alignment adjustments were made every 20 seconds, and fuel pressure monitored constantly to prevent rupture. Crew members noted the sinking of U-461 nearby, only 70 nautical miles from their position, a stark illustration of proximity to mortal danger. Casualty logs indicated that across the Type 14 fleet, 79 of 120 crewmen did not survive the war, underscoring the immense human cost. Broader implications emerged in post-war memoir, compilations, and declassified naval analyses. Authors highlighted that Milchkuh operations represented a unique logistical gamble. A fleet of specialized supply submarines capable of extending the operational range of attack boats, yet inherently fragile and highly vulnerable. Letters archived in the Deutsches Schifffahrtsmuseum emphasized the emotional toll on crew members who witnessed comrades disappear beneath waves with no possibility of rescue. The lessons carried subtle resonance for Cold War planners who considered mobility, stealth, and endurance in nuclear submarine logistics. Type 14 crews' precision, courage, and resilience became touchstones for operational studies, though rarely cited in broader historical narratives. Additional supporting evidence came from interviews conducted in the late 1960s, where widows recounted the weeks of anxiety awaiting telegrams. One widow of Oberbootsman Klaus Reinhardt described receiving a single brief cable stating mission complete, with no details on the perils faced or losses sustained. Veterans recalled that Type 14 missions required simultaneous expertise in navigation, engineering, and seamanship to a degree unmatched by attack-focused U-boats. The disparity between technical mastery and public recognition was striking. Hunters received medals and headlines, whereas the cows remained largely anonymous in official records. Diaries, letters, and reunion notes collectively painted a picture of unsung heroism and enduring trauma. Human consequences were evident in both physical and psychological dimensions. Extended submersion, high-stress fuel transfers, and exposure to enemy attacks left lasting health impacts, including chronic joint issues, respiratory ailments from diesel fumes, and enduring post-traumatic stress. Crew members recounted nights of near hypothermia on wet decks and days of tension watching sonar pings or distant aircraft, balancing survival with mission completion. Letters from families revealed social isolation post-war as the public memory celebrated offensive exploits while the logistical backbone remained forgotten. Recognition, when it came, was often belated, limited to veterans associations or small naval journals. The operational consequence of underappreciation was a near-total absence of preserved oral histories and technical analyses until decades later. By the evening of June 18th, the reunion shifted to silent reflection on the Elbe River's banks, where a small brass plaque commemorated lost Type 14 crews. Veterans placed flowers while recalling the technical and human challenges faced on missions that extended the operational reach of their Wolfpacks. The collective memory emphasized the courage inherent in routine, the constant vigilance required to transfer fuel, and the isolation of a crew whose daily heroism went unnoticed. This chapter set the stage for examining memory and symbolism, tracing how the legacy of Milchkuh crews would be interpreted and mythologized in post-war Germany and beyond. March 5, 1943. BDU Headquarters, Wilhelmshaven. Maps of the North Atlantic covered oak tables as Admiral Karl Donitz reviewed convoy data from March 1st to March 4th, including precise coordinates, tonnage reports, and U-boat engagement logs from U-91, U-130, and U-462. Graphs projected on a wall screen depicted sinking totals. In January 1943, Wolfpacks had destroyed 123,000 tons of Allied shipping. By March, the figure had fallen to 38,000 tons. The room hummed with the quiet tension of officers passing statistical tables and operational reports, noting that fuel shortages aboard Type 7 and Nike submarines, compounded by the loss of the Milchkuh fleet, constrained operational reach. Donit circled several entries with a Mont Blanc fountain pen, emphasizing refueling failures at mid-ocean points near the Azores and Canary Islands. Every missed rendezvous meant a patrol cut short or torpedoed supply. Officers whispered about the limitations imposed by a reliance on specialized fuel submarines, whose visibility and slow speed made them easy targets. Despair had entered the tone of staff memos, previously crisp and confident. Detailed examination revealed systemic vulnerability. Type 14 Milchkuh carried up to 1,200 tons of diesel and 50 tons of torpedoes, designed to extend patrol duration by up to 21 days, yet their maximum speed of 14 knots rendered them incapable of outrunning destroyers or aircraft. Refueling operations required precise alignment within 5 meters, with hoses under constant tension to maintain pump rates of 250 liters per minute. Loss reports indicated that U-488 had been destroyed while refueling U-130, a testament to operational risk compounded by inadequate air cover. In contrast, Allied fleet oilers such as USS Sabine AO-25 could pump 300 liters per minute while maintaining speeds of 16 knots under protective escort and radar coverage. Every technical specification demonstrated the chasm between German ambition and practical execution. Operationally, the inability to project logistical support over the Atlantic effectively forced attack boats into shorter, less effective patrols. Comparative analysis reinforced the imbalance. Whereas BDU relied on stationary or slow-moving mid-Atlantic rendezvous, the U.S. Navy's underway replenishment doctrine allowed oilers to refuel destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft carriers while maintaining convoy speed. Convoy HX-229 in February 1943 saw the U.S. fleet supply 16 ships, totaling 34,000 tons, without a single loss. German reliance on the Milchkuh meant that a single attack could cripple the operational capability of multiple attack submarines. Donitz's logs, catalogued in Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, included frustrated remarks on the limited operational radius of Type 7 once their fuel was exhausted. The Luftwaffe faced similar constraints, with reconnaissance planes grounded due to fuel rationing, exacerbating the collapse of coordinated attacks. Allies had solved the problem of endurance. Germany had not. Field evidence from captured U-boat patrol diaries confirmed the consequences. U-462's entry for April 6, 1943, noted a rendezvous missed by 20 nautical miles due to adverse currents, forcing U-221 to return to base after 5 unsuccessful attack runs. Post-war convoy statistics from the Admiralty showed a sudden drop in tonnage sunk after March 1943 from 38,000 tons to 21,000 tons in the first week of April. Reports cited in U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships document N2734 confirmed that with Milchkuh losses totaling 63% by mid-1943, remaining U-boats operated at 30 to 40% efficiency, unable to sustain Wolfpack operations. Tactical planning meetings described BDU's increasing emphasis on shorter patrols near European coasts, abandoning mid-Atlantic hunting grounds. Operational morale suffered. Broader implications became starkly visible in strategic assessments. Analysts noted that the collapse of the Milchkuh fleet marked a keystone failure without reliable logistical support. BDU could no longer coordinate Wolfpack attacks beyond the continental shelf. Tactical victories, previously celebrated, now became anomalies. Letters from surviving crews described the psychological strain of watching colleagues sink, while their own boats limped back to base with dwindling fuel. Graphs reconstructed from convoy reports highlighted that Allied shipping losses would never again approach pre-March 1943 peaks. The operational dependence on a small number of vulnerable supply submarines had turned into a strategic liability. Additional supporting evidence emerged from cross-referencing Luftwaffe fuel reports and Kriegsmarine operational diaries. Aircraft stationed at Lorient and Brest recorded fuel shortages, preventing reconnaissance flights over key convoy routes. Donitz's office noted in May 1943 that air cover could not be provided for Type 14 movements beyond 60 nautical miles offshore, a restriction that rendered mid-ocean refueling perilous. Engineers had proposed faster, smaller U-tankers, but resource allocation and production delays made implementation impossible. Post-war analyses by historian Clay Blair emphasized that the logistical gap, not merely Allied ASW tactics, determined the collapse of the Atlantic U-boat offensive. Every calculation pointed to a single weak link. Human and operational consequences were immediate. Attack U-boats, dependent on fuel and torpedo resupply, faced truncated patrols and abandoned operations. Crew fatigue increased, with patrols lasting fewer days but requiring equal vigilance, creating stress fractures in operational readiness. Officers recounted ordering boats to return with only partial armament remaining, the prospect of engagement severely limited. Letters from widows described months of waiting, aware that the absence of Milchkuh meant fewer attacks, but also fewer supplies and higher risk for isolated boats. Strategic hope diminished. By late May 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had irrevocably shifted. Convoy statistics, operational logs and staff memos all underscored that the destruction of the Milchkuh was more than tactical loss. It represented the collapse of the logistical backbone of Germany's U-boat strategy. Admiral Dönitz, once confident in ocean-spanning reach, now had to contend with the reality that attack boats could not be sustained. The weak link had fractured the chain. This chapter set the stage for examining the long-term symbolic memory of the Milchkuh, tracing their legacy beyond operational records and into the narratives of endurance, risk, and unsung service. April 10th, 1943. U-boat propaganda studio, Berlin Tempelhof. Film reels spun through a Moviola editing machine, showing Type 14 Milchkuh alongside attack U-boats in meticulously staged mid-Atlantic resupply sequences. Cinematographer Karl-Heinz Wegner framed fuel hoses stretching between vessels, emphasizing precision and triumph, while narration lauded crews' courage under unseen threats. Stills from these reels were later catalogued in the Reichsfilm archive under document RF 2129, and they circulated among the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe morale offices. Posters displayed alongside the reels celebrated Die Königinnen der Meer, portraying Milchkuh as indispensable giants of strategy. Each frame exaggerated operational success, masking the frequency of missed rendezvous, fuel shortages, and vulnerability to Allied aircraft. Officers noted that while the propaganda inspired belief in extended patrol endurance, technical reports from March 1943 onward documented repeated failure to complete scheduled transfers. The contrast between cinematic portrayal and operational reality was already widening. Technical details exposed the disparity. Type 14 displacement measured 1,769 tons surfaced and 2,090 tons submerged, with a beam of 6 meters and a draft of 5.5 meters, designed to pump up to 250 liters of diesel per minute through specialized hoses. U-463's war diary for April 2nd, 1943, recorded a failed refueling of U-515 due to storm-induced misalignment, illustrating that practical conditions rarely mirrored propaganda. By comparison, Allied underway replenishment systems such as USS Cimarron AO-22 could maintain fuel flow at 300 liters per minute, even in sea state 4, while sustaining speed of 16 knots. Every technical specification pointed to the limitations of German innovation against environmental and operational realities. The human consequence: crews often returned to base with depleted fuel and morale. Comparative analysis reinforced these shortcomings. Allied intelligence reports, including Office of Naval Intelligence document on I-8943, mockingly described Milchkuh as cows for slaughter, emphasizing their visibility and vulnerability. US and British escort tactics focused on neutralizing supply submarines first, understanding that once resupply failed, Wolfpacks would falter. BDU logs from March 1943 confirmed this strategic fragility. 3 Type 14S, sunk within a fortnight, caused multiple attack U-boats to abandon patrols. By contrast, Allied fleet oilers operated under protective screens, radar coverage, and air support, making them far less susceptible to enemy interdiction. The operational gap was stark and quantifiable. Field evidence illustrated consequences in operational terms. After the loss of U-488 on April 4, 1943, patrol logs noted that U-201 and U-262 had to terminate mid-Atlantic operations prematurely due to insufficient fuel. Convoy SC-121, monitored through Admiralty charts, experienced minimal loss in late March, attributed directly to the absence of resupply capability for BDU's attack boats. Memoirs of crew members, later archived in Bundesarchiv Militär Archive, described watching the sinking Milchkuh as a psychological blow greater than actual engagement. Every missed rendezvous and lost tanker magnified operational risk, forcing Donitz to recalculate patrol strategies toward shorter coastal runs. Broader implications emerged rapidly. The Milchkuh, once a symbol of tactical audacity, now reflected strategic desperation. Short-term morale improvements had masked the reliance on a vulnerable supply chain, and the collapse of that chain revealed the brittle underpinnings of BDU strategy. Letters from U-boat crews' families noted relief at patrols being cut short, but also anxiety at the perceived inevitability of loss. Graphs in post-war analyses, including Clay Blair's Hitler's U-boat war, demonstrate that shipping losses plummeted as Milchkuh disappeared, underscoring the symbolic link between these submarines and overall operational capacity. The visual triumphs of propaganda failed to conceal the operational collapse. Additional supporting evidence came from Donitz's private diaries. Entries dated April 12, 1943, reflected recognition that the loss of supply boats signaled a turning point. Without the Königin, Wolfpacks are shadows of themselves. Propaganda images no longer aligned with operational reality, and morale within attack crews began a rapid decline. Technical manuals annotated by crew members emphasized the skill required for mid-ocean refueling, skill now rendered moot by vessel losses. Allied assessment confirmed this. Intelligence bulletins encouraged targeting Milchkuh first, codifying the strategy into the phrase "hit the supply, kill the pack." Strategic desperation was now institutionalized. Human and operational consequences unfolded in tandem. Crews accustomed to extended patrols found their endurance sharply curtailed, and psychological strain intensified as resupply options vanished. Letters from widows and veterans recount anxiety over long intervals without contact, highlighting the emotional dimension of logistical failure. Comparisons with Allied logistics further accentuated disparities. U.S. Navy and Royal Navy sailors benefited from robust underway replenishment, protective screens, and integrated air cover, while German crews faced isolated, high-risk operations. Every resupply lost represented not merely fuel, but hours of vigilance, lives at stake, and morale dissipated. By late April 1943, the Milchkuh had become emblematic, bold instruments of tactical ingenuity, but markers of strategic futility. Propaganda had cast them as giants conquering the Atlantic, but operational records, Allied reports, and personal testimonies reframed them as desperate gambles. This chapter established a philosophical lens, highlighting how technology can symbolize both daring and vulnerability. The narrative now prepares to examine the intersection of technological innovation, human endurance, and the enduring lessons of wartime logistical experiments in the following chapter. March 5, 1944, Kiel Naval Shipyard, Germany. Engineers from Blohm and Voss meticulously inspected U-861, a Type 92 submarine temporarily stripped of torpedo armament to accommodate extra fuel tanks for extended supply missions. Clipboards recorded every clearance measurement, while technicians measured fuel pump output to within 1 liter per minute, recalibrating valves designed to transfer up to 250 liters per minute under open sea conditions. War diaries, archived in Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv document BAMA 1543, noted that removing offensive armament increased fuel capacity by 35%, but also left vessels defenseless against convoy escorts. Observers realized that each technical innovation introduced new vulnerabilities, and operational success became contingent on coordination that was increasingly unattainable. Crews were required to perform calculations under stress to ensure proper distribution of diesel and torpedo substitutes. Engineers photographed and sketched every pump and hose fitting, anticipating post-war study. Technical analysis revealed the paradox of innovation. Type 14 Milchkuh were designed with diesel engines producing 2,200 horsepower, allowing maximum speed of 14 knots surfaced and 7 knots submerged. The submarine's cargo volume of 350 tons of fuel could theoretically extend attack U-boat patrols by 1,500 kilometers. Yet practical losses due to weather, misalignment during transfer, and Allied interception reduced efficiency to below 60%. By comparison, U.S. fleet oilers like USS Cimarron AO-22 delivered over 800 tons of fuel per voyage under protected escort, demonstrating superior operational throughput. The disparity highlighted that while German technical ingenuity solved one logistical problem, it created exposure that the Allies could exploit. Comparisons further emphasized systemic divergence. Allied replenishment relied on multi-layered defense, including radar coverage, escorting destroyers, and long-range PBY Catalina patrol aircraft, whereas Milchkuh operated with minimal support, rendering them high-value targets. U.S. Navy reports, including Bureau of Ships Study Bishop's 1946 sub-resupply, concluded that vulnerability outweighed technological gains. German engineers had produced innovative quick-connect fuel hoses and pressurized transfer systems, but without sufficient defensive strategy, the technical achievement could not translate into strategic success. Every encounter demonstrated that ingenuity required context to be effective. Field reports corroborated operational fragility. U-488's attempt to refuel U-264 on April 2, 1943, failed after a rogue Atlantic swell ruptured a main fuel line, spilling over 150 tons of diesel into the sea. Patrol logs showed that U-201 and U-262 had to abort subsequent missions due to depleted fuel reserves. Crew testimonies, later collected in memoirs archived in Hamburg's Deutsches U-Boot Museum, described the compounded stress of performing precise engineering tasks while evading air and naval patrols. Each mechanical success remained temporary, undermined by the operational environment. Broader implications emerged as naval theorists revisited these cases post-war. Charts correlating technical innovations with average U-boat survival time demonstrated a paradox. Type 7 is, with upgraded engines and radar detection, survived on average 45 days, whereas Milchkuh-equipped Type 14S survived only 27 days per mission. The lesson crystallized: technological fixes without integrated strategy or resources only defer systemic failure. Analysts in the Naval War College incorporated these data into case studies, emphasizing that innovation must be balanced against logistics, protection, and timing. Additional evidence arose from Allied interception of German research. British intelligence reports, Michigan 14 1944, documented Soviet interest in captured Milchkuh plans for potential undersea resupply of ballistic missile submarines. The Soviets noted the technical sophistication but also the operational risk, confirming that even powerful nations recognized the trade-offs inherent in these designs. Post-war textbooks cited Milchkuh as cautionary examples of technological overreach, achieving one tactical advantage while simultaneously increasing vulnerability elsewhere. Lessons included precise fuel flow management, hull integrity under weight stress, and coordination under limited communication bandwidth. Human and operational consequences were severe. Crews faced psychological strain managing complex fuel transfers while remaining exposed to enemy action. Letters from surviving submariners recount the dissonance between pride in technical skill and terror at operational exposure. Repeated losses eroded morale. Entire Wolfpacks returned early or failed to engage convoys. The operational paradox became personal innovation that should have extended endurance, instead condensed exposure and accelerated attrition. By mid-1944, the Milchkuh had become emblematic of the broader lesson in wartime innovation. The paradox was clear: technical brilliance could not substitute for strategic alignment, sufficient resources, or timing in the operational environment. This reflection sets the stage for the next chapter, exploring how human memory preserves both the triumphs and failures of technological audacity. Linking the Milchkuh's story to enduring cultural and historical consciousness. October 17th, 2023. Waters off the Azores, 62 meters below the surface. A team of divers from the Ocean Exploration Institute descended toward the rusting hull of U-489, its identification number barely legible beneath 30 meters of encrusted marine growth. Cameras captured every scar and breached plate, while remotely operated vehicles mapped the surrounding seabed with sonar beams, producing three-dimensional renderings accurate to within half a meter. The Milchkuh, once the lifelines of the Atlantic, now rested silent, holding the remains of 46 crew members lost on their final mission. Archival data from the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv confirmed that U-489 sank on November 12, 1943, after an attack by convoy escorts east of the Azores. Each structural deformation told a story of mechanical stress, torpedo impact, and the relentless Atlantic currents reshaping metal over decades. The divers logged coordinates and depth, ensuring the site met war grave protection under international law, a designation preserving the wrecks as both historical and human memorials. Technical examination revealed enduring insights. U-489's Type 14 hull measured 67 meters in length, with a beam of 9 meters and a draft of 6 meters, originally displacing over 1,600 tons surfaced. Fuel transfer pipes, originally designed to pump 250 liters per minute under open sea conditions, were corroded beyond function, yet the framework still demonstrated engineering ingenuity for high-volume at-sea replenishment. Comparing these specifications with modern auxiliary submarines, such as the U.S. Navy's USS Emory S. Land, AS-39, reveals a stark difference. Contemporary vessels prioritize defensive capabilities and automation, while Milchkuh emphasized maximal cargo capacity at the expense of crew safety. Sonar imagery confirmed the same structural arrangement for U-459, lying over 700 meters deep, its hull crushed under pressure but retaining the tubular alignment of fuel conduits. The comparison highlights operational trade-offs. Allied fleet oilers, protected by air cover and escorted by destroyers, could deliver over 800 tons of fuel per voyage while maintaining crew safety, demonstrating a clear strategic advantage in logistics over German methods. Milchkuh, designed to extend the reach of attack U-boats, were forced into isolated operations without escort, making them vulnerable to depth charges and long-range patrol bombers. Intelligence reports, including Admiralty Assessment ADM 199-44, mockingly referred to them as cows for slaughter, noting that the very vessels meant to sustain the Wolfpacks became their Achilles heel. Each innovation came at a cost. The more fuel carried, the more conspicuous and fragile the vessel. Field evidence from recent expeditions confirms operational peril. Sonar scans of U-459 show breached pressure holes consistent with detonations rather than structural collapse, corroborating historical accounts of attacks by British destroyers on June 8, 1943. Divers observed sections where torpedo tubes were removed to accommodate fuel tanks, confirming archival construction plans. The wreck site of U-488 similarly revealed twisted fuel manifolds, matching the April 2, 1943 report in Kriegstagebuch U-488 that documented a failed resupply due to rough Atlantic swells spilling over 150 tons of diesel. Each site illustrates that mechanical ingenuity could not counteract environmental and tactical hazards. Broader implications emerge from these silent wrecks. The loss of approximately 300 crew members across the Milchkuh fleet underscores the human cost of prioritizing technical solutions over survivable operations. Charts developed by modern naval historians overlay innovation timelines with U-boat survival curves, showing that Type 14S rarely exceeded 27 days per mission compared to 45 days for standard Type 7 is. These wrecks, while inert, communicate the same lesson posthumously. Extraordinary technical design cannot substitute for comprehensive strategy and defensive coordination. Additional evidence arises from memorials and family testimonies. Descendants of U-461 and U-488 crews, visiting Hamburg's Ehrenmal der U-Boot-Fahrer, recounted letters from widows noting both pride and anguish over the lost vessels. Personal narratives emphasize that, While Allied analysts celebrated the collapse of the Milchkuh as a strategic triumph, families remembered the human ingenuity and bravery involved. Documents from Deutsches U-Boot Museum archives include detailed crew rosters, casualty figures, and operational reports, linking technical history with emotional legacy. These intersecting records enrich understanding beyond statistics, framing the wrecks as both engineering artifacts and human memorials. Human and operational consequences remain stark. Divers note the confined crew spaces, corroded bunks, and original navigational instruments preserved in situ, giving tangible insight into the cramped, high-stress environment. Crews had to manage fuel transfer calculations while evading Allied detection, often in complete darkness and under threat of sudden depth charge attacks. Psychological strain compounded mechanical risk, illustrating that technical complexity did not reduce, but amplified the stakes for human operators. The silent hulls bear witness to both courage and vulnerability. By late October 2023, the expedition concluded, and teams surfaced with sonar maps, photographic documentation, and coordinate logs for preservation under international law. The Milchkuh now rest as enduring symbols, technical ingenuity intertwined with strategic overreach, human skill overshadowed by environmental and operational reality. These ghostly wrecks prepare the stage for the final chapter, meditating on history, memory, and the long shadow cast by vessels that were once lifelines, but now are solemn monuments on the ocean floor. October 10th, 2023, North Atlantic, 35 kilometers south of the Azores. Calm waves stretched across the ocean surface, while remotely operated vehicles hovered over the rusted remains of U-489 and U-488, their hulls encrusted with decades of marine life, yet still bearing faded Kriegsmarine identification numbers. Archived war diaries from BDU, located at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, lay open aboard the research vessel, pages yellowed, ink smudged, detailing fuel transfers of 250 tons per sortie and patrol coordinates across the North Atlantic. Allied after-action reports, including ADM 199-44, documented the sinking of U-489 on November 12, 1943, and U-488 on April 2, 1943, both pivotal blows to the Milchkuh fleet. Cameras captured every scar, from breached pressure hulls to bent periscopes, emphasizing the human cost of strategic overreach. Modern GPS mapping confirmed the wreck's exact positions within 10 meters, establishing their designation as protected war graves under international law. These vessels, once lifelines to the Wolfpacks, now rest in silent testament to endurance and fragility. Technical inspection revealed that U-489's Type 14 hull spanned 67 meters in length, with a beam of 9 meters and draft of 6 meters, originally displacing 1,660 tons surfaced and nearly 1,850 tons submerged. Fuel transfer manifolds, capable of pumping 250 liters per minute in open sea conditions, were twisted but identifiable, demonstrating engineering ingenuity designed for rapid resupply of Type 6 IC TAC U-boats. Sonar mapping of U-459 at 700 meters depth confirmed identical internal configurations, including fuel tanks of 600 cubic meters and auxiliary electric pumps rated at 120 horsepower. Comparison with U.S. Navy auxiliary submarine USS Emory S. Land AS-39 illustrates a divergence. American vessels emphasized defensive armor, automated systems, and multi-role capability, whereas Milchkuh maximized cargo capacity at the expense of crew safety. Archival Krieg stagebook entries note the necessity of precise pump calibration under rolling seas, reflecting the operational difficulty of German logistics. Strategic contrast underscores operational risk. Allied fleet oilers, escorted by destroyers and protected by long-range aircraft, could deliver 800 tons of fuel per voyage while maintaining crew safety, highlighting superior coordination and force protection. Milchkuh operated unescorted in remote Atlantic sectors, relying on stealth and surprise, rendering them exceptionally vulnerable to depth charges and maritime patrol aircraft. Intelligence summaries mockingly dubbed them cows for slaughter, acknowledging that these supply submarines, meant to sustain offensive operations, became prime targets for destruction. The German operational philosophy prioritized short-term tactical reach, whereas Allied planning integrated logistics into sustained strategic outcomes. Field evidence corroborates these risks. Sonar imaging of U-459 revealed hull breaches consistent with torpedo detonations, while U-488's twisted fuel pipes mirrored reports of April 2, 1943, when rough seas spilt 150 tons of diesel during an attempted replenishment. Divers photographed corroded bunks, collapsed bulkheads, and remaining navigation instruments, confirming written accounts from Kriegsstagebuch U-488. The data reveal that the very innovations designed to extend U-boat reach simultaneously increased exposure to mechanical failure and enemy detection. Technical creativity could not compensate for tactical isolation. The broader implications are stark. Approximately 300 crew members perished across the Milchkuh fleet, a testament to the human toll of specialized technical innovation. Comparative analyses demonstrate that Type 14S rarely exceeded 27 days per mission, while Type SIPs achieved 45-day patrols when supplied conventionally. Naval historians overlay survival curves with innovation charts, demonstrating that engineering brilliance alone did not ensure operational sustainability. The Milchkuh illustrate a paradox. Extraordinary technical problem-solving can exacerbate vulnerability when strategic context is neglected. Supporting evidence emerges from memorialization and human accounts. Descendants of U-461 and U-488 crews visiting Hamburg's Ehrenmol der U-Bootfahrer shared letters from widows detailing pride in technical accomplishment alongside grief over lost lives. Documents from Deutsches U-Boot Museum provide crew rosters, operational logs, and casualty data, linking physical wrecks with human memory. The juxtaposition of rusted steel and meticulously recorded records underscores that historical significance encompasses both machinery and human experience. Human and operational consequences remain tangible. Divers noted the confined living quarters, corroded bunks, and original instrumentation still in place, providing insight into the extreme conditions crews endured while performing high-stakes fuel transfers under threat of Allied attack. Psychological and operational strain intersected. Errors in fuel transfer or navigation could be fatal, demonstrating that technical ingenuity amplified rather than mitigated danger. These wrecks, silent yet precise in their remnants, bear witness to both courage and the vulnerabilities inherent in wartime logistics. By late October 2023, the expedition concluded with sonar maps, photographic documentation, and GPS coordinates archived for preservation under international law. The Milchkuh now lie as enduring symbols, technical ingenuity entwined with operational peril, human skill overshadowed by environmental and enemy factors, and strategic overreach memorialized beneath calm Atlantic waves. These silent giants, once lifelines in the oceanic expanse, serve as solemn reminders that the infrastructure of war, its supply chains, support vessels, and logistical decisions, shapes outcomes as decisively as the weapons they deliver. The Atlantic keeps their story, waiting for reflection.